There is a category of human body that does not resolve neatly into any single competitive domain. It is not deficient. It is not extraordinary. It exists at the precise intersection of multiple athletic possibilities, none of which it can fully realize. Travis Michael Kelce, born October 5, 1989 in Westlake, Ohio, and raised in Cleveland Heights, represents one of the most consequential examples of this phenomenon in the history of American professional sports marketing. Not because of what he accomplished on the field, though his career statistics place him among the greatest tight ends ever to play the game, but because the anthropometric profile that determined his athletic ceiling simultaneously constructed the psychological, cultural, and social architecture that would make him one of the most powerful marketing instruments in modern sports history. To understand why this matters, one must first understand the body itself and the cascading series of invisible determinations that a body of his dimensions initiates the moment it enters competitive athletics. At his pro day following the 2013 NFL Combine, Kelce measured 6 feet 5 inches tall and weighed 255 pounds. His arm length registered at 33 3/4 inches, which translates to a wingspan of approximately 68 inches, or roughly a +3 differential relative to his height. His hand size measured 9 5/8 inches. He ran the 40-yard dash in 4.61 seconds, completed the 3-cone drill in 7.09 seconds, posted a vertical leap of 35 inches, and a broad jump of 124 inches. These numbers, when viewed in isolation, register as impressive but not historic. They did not produce a first-round draft selection. They placed him as the 5th tight end taken in his class, behind Tyler Eifert, Zach Ertz, Gavin Escobar, and Vance McDonald. The Kansas City Chiefs selected him 63rd overall in the 3rd round. The numbers were good enough but not transcendent, and this distinction between sufficiency and transcendence is not merely semantic. It is the foundational paradox of Kelce's entire trajectory, and it is the paradox from which every subsequent marketing insight in this case study emerges. Consider what 6 feet 5 inches and 255 pounds actually means in the ecology of elite male athletics. In basketball, which Kelce played at Cleveland Heights High School alongside football and baseball, this body occupies a deeply uncomfortable positional zone. He's too short and too heavy to operate effectively as a small forward at the collegiate or professional level, where the positional prototype has migrated toward bodies in the 6'6" to 6'8" range, with wingspans exceeding +5 and body fat percentages hovering around 8 to 10%. He's too short to be a power forward in any system that demands switchable perimeter defense, which by the mid-2000s had become the dominant requirement at that position in Division I basketball. And he is insufficiently long, at +3 wingspan, to compensate for his height deficiency through defensive versatility. At 255 pounds, even accounting for the lighter frame he would have carried in high school, he was almost certainly deployed as a post player, a role in which his athleticism would have been conspicuous in a high school context, but fundamentally insufficient against the length, explosiveness, and skeletal advantages of the bodies that populate collegiate basketball at the power forward and center positions. This is not a failure of talent, it is a structural outcome of the biomechanical lottery. The body that Kelce carries is built for collision sports. It is built for environments in which mass distribution, hip flexibility, short area quickness, and hand strength converge. Basketball does not reward this particular combination of attributes past a certain competitive threshold. What it does produce, however, and this is the first critical insight of this case study, is a specific psychological residue. The athlete who transitions from basketball to the tight end position in football does not simply switch sports. He carries forward a tacit understanding that somewhere, in some alternative configuration of his physical attributes, there existed a version of himself that operated in a higher status athletic domain. Basketball in America is not merely a sport. It is a cultural institution with a valence structure that places it adjacent to music, fashion, and media in ways that football, despite its economic supremacy, has never achieved. The basketball player, even the failed basketball player, retains a cultural orientation that is qualitatively different from the athlete who was exclusively a football player. This orientation manifests in ways that are subtle but measurable. It shows up in movement vocabulary, it shows up in aesthetic sensibility, and critically, it shows up in the way the individual relates to visibility, style, and self-presentation. The tight end position is, in many respects, the athletic graveyard of basketball ambition. This is not a pejorative description. It is a structural observation that can be verified by examining the athletic biographies of virtually every elite tight end in the modern NFL. Antonio Gates played basketball at Kent State and never played college football. Jimmy Graham played basketball at the University of Miami. Tony Gonzalez played basketball at the University of California, Berkeley. Julius Thomas played basketball at Portland State. The pattern is so consistent that it constitutes an unwritten pipeline, a positional migration route from the basketball court to the football field that follows a remarkably consistent anthropometric template. The men who populate this pipeline share a common physical profile. They are between 6'3" and 6'6". They weigh between 230 and 260. They possess above average but not elite vertical explosiveness. They have hand sizes large enough to secure a football but not long enough to disrupt passing lanes in basketball. And they carry a body composition that, at its playing weight, hovers in the 12 to 16% body fat range, which is too heavy for basketball, but optimal for the blocking and receiving demands of the tight end position. What has never been adequately theorized in either sports science or sports marketing literature is the psychological consequence of this transition. The athlete who lands at tight end from basketball does not simply adopt a new position. He internalizes a specific form of positional melancholy, a tacit awareness that the domain he operates in is secondary to the one he left behind. This is not depression. It is not dissatisfaction. It is more accurately described as a persistent orientation toward a higher status aesthetic and cultural framework that the athlete carries with him into a lower status positional context. You can see this orientation manifest in real time across the NFL. Myles Garrett, the Cleveland Browns defensive end, who stands 6'4" and 272 pounds, routinely appears at Cleveland Cavaliers games in the slam dunk competition line, despite carrying a multi-million-dollar football contract. The rational economic actor would never risk injury in a recreational basketball context when his earning capacity is entirely derived from football. But Garrett is not making an economic calculation. He is enacting a psychological compulsion rooted in the same positional melancholy that structures the tight end pipeline. The body remembers what it was built for, even when the market has redirected it elsewhere. For Kelce specifically, this melancholy takes on additional dimensions. His brother Jason Kelce was an offensive lineman, a position that in the NFL is overwhelmingly populated by white males and carries virtually no cultural currency outside of football analytics communities. The offensive lineman is perhaps the least marketable position in all of professional sports. The body required, typically 6'3" to 6'5" and 290 to 320 pounds, is explicitly non-aesthetic by the standards of mainstream American culture. It is functional mass. It communicates power but not desirability. It operates in anonymity by design, as offensive linemen wear helmets that obscure their faces and perform their most critical functions in the interior of the formation, where cameras rarely linger. Travis Kelce would have understood this distinction from an early age, not because he analyzed it intellectually, but because he lived beside it. He saw what it meant to be an offensive lineman's brother. He understood, tacitly, that the body at 255 pounds occupies a fundamentally different social position than the body at 305 pounds. Even when both bodies are white and male and playing football for the same high school in the same suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. This differential matters enormously for what follows in this case study, because it establishes the first layer of what will eventually become Kelce's marketing architecture. The body at 255 pounds can wear tailored clothing. It can move through social spaces with a physical grace that the body at 305 pounds cannot replicate. Not because of any deficiency in the heavier body, but because the garment industry, the fashion economy, and the visual grammar of American media are all calibrated to bodies in the 220 to 260 range. The man at this weight exists in a zone of aesthetic possibility. He is large enough to communicate physical dominance, but lean enough to access the sartorial codes that signal refinement, taste, and cultural attunement. He can wear a slim-cut suit without alteration beyond standard tailoring. He can wear streetwear without it reading as costume. He can stand next to a wide receiver at 6'1" and 190 pounds and not appear categorically different in the way that an offensive lineman at 310 pounds would. This adjacency, this ability to visually belong in the proximity of positions that carry higher cultural currency, is not a trivial detail. It is the biomechanical foundation upon which an entire marketing identity can be constructed. The combine numbers reinforce this. A 4.61 40-yard dash at 255 pounds is not the number of a pure speed athlete. But it is the number of an athlete whose body has been cross-trained in basketball movements, the lateral shuffles, the defensive slides, the vertical leaping patterns that develop fast twitch muscle fiber recruitment in configurations that pure football training does not. His three-cone drill at 7.09 seconds reveals hip fluidity and directional agility that are hallmarks of athletes who spent formative years in sports requiring constant multi-directional movement. His 35-inch vertical, while not extraordinary by basketball standards, places him in the 95th percentile for tight ends and is comparable to many edge rushers who are celebrated for their explosive first step. What the combine data tells us, when read through the framework being developed here, is that Kelce's body is a composite artifact of multiple athletic domains, none of which claimed him completely, all of which left traces in his movement, his physiology, and his psychological orientation. This composite quality is precisely what makes the body marketable in ways that a more specialized body is not. The pure football body, the offensive lineman's body, the nose tackle's body, communicates a single message. I am built for one purpose. The composite body communicates versatility, adaptability, and a kind of physical cosmopolitanism that resonates with audiences beyond the core football demographic. When people describe Travis Kelce as looking like he could be a model or an actor or a talk show host, they are not making an aesthetic judgment in isolation. They are responding to the composite quality of his body, the way it signals competence across multiple domains without being captive to any single one. This is the anthropometric threshold. It is the precise physical configuration that generates maximum optionality, not on the field, where Kelce's body would eventually be deployed to historic effect, but in the cultural marketplace, where the body must communicate something beyond athletic function in order to generate the kind of brand value that transcends the sport itself. The implications of this threshold extend far beyond individual athleticism. They connect to deep structures in American consumer psychology, where the male body is evaluated along axes that are rarely articulated but consistently enforced. The ideal male body in American media is not the largest body or the most muscular body. It is the body that communicates the greatest range of capability without tipping into any single extreme. This is why the Hollywood leading man tends to hover around 6 feet and 185 pounds, why the male fashion model tends towards 6'1" and 165 pounds, and why the NFL player who breaks through into mainstream cultural visibility tends to be a quarterback, a wide receiver, or a tight end, rather than a defensive tackle or an offensive guard. The body at 255 with a +3 wingspan and 9 5/8 inch hands exists at the upper boundary of this ideal range. It is large enough to be physically imposing in any room, but lean enough to be legible within the visual systems of fashion, entertainment, and mass media. It is, in a very literal sense, the body most optimized for cultural export out of the NFL ecosystem. What no one understood in 2013, when the Kansas City Chiefs used their third-round selection on this body, was that they were not merely drafting a tight end. They were acquiring a physical platform upon which an unprecedented marketing edifice would eventually be constructed. The anthropometric threshold that placed Kelce between basketball and football, between offensive line and wide receiver, between aesthetic invisibility and cultural visibility, was not a limitation. It was a condition of possibility. Every dimension of his subsequent ascent, from his fashion choices to his relationship with Kayla Nicole to his eventual partnership with Taylor Swift, traces back to this body, to this threshold, to the precise configuration of height, weight, wingspan, and body composition that placed him in a liminal zone where the maximum number of cultural narratives could attach to him simultaneously. The body did not merely carry the athlete, it constructed the market. To fully grasp the magnitude of what the anthropometric threshold produces, it is necessary to examine its inverse, the bodies that do not occupy this zone. Consider the defensive tackle at 6'2" and 315 pounds. This body generates enormous economic value within the football ecosystem. It commands contracts in the range of $15 to $25 million annually at the elite level, but it generates virtually zero cultural capital outside of that ecosystem. The defensive tackle does not receive invitations to host Saturday Night Live. He does not appear on the cover of GQ. He does not receive endorsement offers from fashion houses or fragrance brands. The reason is not prejudice, it is mathematics. The defensive tackle's body does not fit the visual grammar of any cultural marketplace outside of football. The garment industry cannot dress it without custom fabrication. The entertainment industry cannot cast it without relegating it to a narrow category of roles. The fashion economy cannot incorporate it into any existing aesthetic framework without modification. The body is too specialized, too committed to a single functional purpose, to operate as a versatile cultural signifier. Now, consider the wide receiver at 6 feet and 185 pounds. This body generates significant cultural capital. Wide receivers are among the most visible and marketable players in the NFL. They run routes in open space where cameras can capture their movements in full. They celebrate touchdowns with choreographed gestures that circulate on social media. They dress flamboyantly, attend fashion weeks, and cultivate personal brands that extend well beyond their on-field production. But the wide receiver's body, precisely because it is optimized for cultural visibility, does not carry the same physical gravitas as the tight end's body. It does not communicate the dual capacity for elegance and force that characterizes the body at the threshold. The wide receiver is legible as a cultural figure, but less legible as a figure of physical authority. He can model clothing, but he cannot anchor a narrative about masculine power in the way that a larger body can. He is an aesthete, not a hybrid. Kelce's body, situated between these two archetypes, borrows from both without being captured by either. It carries the physical authority of the lineman's body and the aesthetic accessibility of the receiver's body. It can stand in a fashion spread and communicate both power and refinement simultaneously. It can appear on a talk show set and not seem diminished by the smaller scale of the furniture, the lighting, and the camera framing that are all designed for bodies significantly smaller than his. This is not a skill. It is a structural attribute of the body itself, an emergent property of the anthropometric profile that places him at the threshold. And it is this attribute, more than any deliberate marketing strategy that created the conditions for everything that followed. The pro day numbers deserve one final reading in this context. When Kelce ran a 4.61 40-yard dash, he demonstrated something that scouts and analysts evaluated purely through a football lens. But the same number, read through the marketing framework being constructed here, communicates something entirely different. It communicates that this body can move, not in the specialized, linear way that a sprinter moves, but in the adaptive, multi-contextual way that a body must move to operate across multiple cultural settings. The man who runs a 4.61 at 2:55 can dance at a charity gala without appearing stiff. He can navigate a red carpet without the lumbering gait that marks larger athletes as out of place in non-athletic settings. He can play pickup basketball on camera, as Kelce has done numerous times, without the visual dissonance that would attend a 300-pound lineman attempting the same activity. Speed, in this context, is not an athletic metric. It is a measure of cultural transferability. It indicates the degree to which the body can move from one social context to another without losing legibility, without appearing foreign or misplaced. The broad jump at 124 inches tells a similar story. Explosive hip extension of that magnitude at that body weight indicates a neuromuscular system that has been trained for maximum force production across multiple planes of movement. In basketball, this manifests as rebounding ability and defensive recovery speed. In football, it manifests as the ability to separate from linebackers at the top of routes and to absorb contact from safeties without going to ground. In the cultural marketplace, it manifests as physical dynamism, the kind of kinetic energy that reads on camera, that animates a stage presence, that makes a body appear alive and engaged rather than static and inert. Every combined metric, when refracted through this lens, reveals itself as a dual index, one measuring athletic capacity, the other measuring cultural mobility. Kelce's numbers were not transcendent in either domain, but they were sufficient in both, and that sufficiency, that threshold-level competence across multiple evaluative frameworks, is precisely what makes the body a marketing technology rather than merely an athletic instrument. This is the foundational argument of this case study. Travis Kelce is not merely an athlete who happens to be marketable. He is a body whose precise anthropometric configuration generates marketing capacity as a primary output, with athletic performance operating as the delivery mechanism that places that body in the public eye. The tight end position is the vehicle. The combine numbers are the specifications. The cultural marketplace is the actual arena of competition. And the anthropometric threshold, that narrow band of physical dimensions where maximum cultural optionality resides, is the invisible architecture that makes the entire system operational. Everything that follows in the subsequent 9 sections of this analysis, from Cleveland Heights to Cincinnati, from the locker room to the runway, from Kayla Nicole to Taylor Swift, is a consequence of this threshold. It is the origin point, the seed crystal from which the entire marketing edifice grows, and it has never, until now, been adequately described. Marketing theory has traditionally treated the environments in which individuals are raised as background variables, contextual details that may inform but do not determine the brand architectures those individuals later construct or embody. This is a fundamental error. The environment in which Travis Kelce was formed, Cleveland Heights, Ohio, is not a biographical footnote. It is the first and most critical piece of infrastructure in the marketing system that his body would eventually become. Cleveland Heights is a suburb of Cleveland, situated in Cuyahoga County, with a current population of approximately 44,700 residents. Its racial composition, according to the most recent American Community Survey data, breaks down to approximately 46 to 48% white, 39 to 40% Black or African American, 5 to 6% Asian, and smaller percentages of multiracial and other populations. The median household income is roughly $72,000. The median age hovers around 36. 60% of its housing stock was constructed before 1940. These are not inert statistics. They describe a physical and social environment of extraordinary and unusual diversity, the kind of diversity that produces specific cognitive and cultural outcomes in the individuals who are immersed in it during their formative developmental years. To understand why Cleveland Heights matters to this case study, one must first understand what diversity produces when it is not curated, managed, or institutionally mediated, but simply lived. There is a critical distinction between diversity as policy and diversity as ecology. Diversity as policy is what exists in corporate boardrooms, university admissions offices, and human resources departments. It is the deliberate construction of heterogeneous groupings for purposes that are explicitly stated and institutionally monitored. Diversity as ecology is something qualitatively different. It is what exists when a neighborhood, by virtue of its housing stock, its proximity to urban centers, its historical settlement patterns, and its economic accessibility, simply contains people from different racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds who share schools, streets, grocery stores, barbershops, churches, and recreational spaces without any organizing principle other than geographic proximity. Cleveland Heights is a diversity ecology. It is not diverse because someone decided it should be. It is diverse because the forces of 20th century American urbanization, the Great Migration, white flight patterns that partially reversed, the preservation of early 20th century housing stock that attracted both working class and professional class families, and the proximity to Case Western Reserve University and other educational institutions all converge to produce a community in which nearly half the population is white and nearly 40% is black, with significant Asian and multiracial populations making up the remainder. Jason Kelce, Travis's older brother, articulated this directly in interviews about their upbringing. He described Cleveland Heights as very diverse in thought, culture, and economics. He noted that he and Travis were fortunate to play sports, attend school, and play music with children from all sorts of backgrounds and walks of life. He characterized this as exposure to perspectives and experiences that many people do not receive. This is not a sentimental observation. It is a precise description of what developmental psychologists call ambient cultural fluency, the form of cross-cultural competence that develops not through formal instruction or deliberate practice, but through sustained, immersive exposure to cultural norms, communication styles, aesthetic preferences, and social codes that differ from one's own. The critical variable is not the diversity itself, but the immersiveness of the exposure. A white child who attends a predominantly white school in a predominantly white suburb and occasionally encounters black classmates in a controlled institutional setting does not develop ambient cultural fluency. That child develops awareness of difference, which is a cognitively and socially distinct outcome. The child who grows up in Cleveland Heights, attending Cleveland Heights High School, playing on sports teams that reflect the community's demographic composition, sharing locker rooms and bus rides and post-game meals with teammates who are black, white, Asian, and multiracial, develops something far more consequential. That child develops the ability to read, interpret, and eventually deploy cultural codes that originate outside of his own racial and socioeconomic background. This is not cultural appropriation. It is not cultural tourism. It is not even cultural appreciation, which implies a subject-object relationship between the appreciator and the culture being appreciated. It is something more fundamental and more powerful. It is the acquisition of cultural operating systems, tacit knowledge structures, that allow an individual to navigate social environments that were not designed for someone of his demographic profile. The distinction matters because cultural operating systems, unlike cultural artifacts, cannot be stolen, borrowed, or imitated. They can only be acquired through immersion, through the kind of sustained, unmediated contact with cultural difference that Cleveland Heights provided. Travis Kelce did not learn how to be culturally fluent in black social spaces by watching television or listening to hip-hop music. He learned it by growing up next to black families, by playing alongside black athletes, by sitting in classrooms where the cultural reference points were not monolithically white, and by absorbing the ambient social data that such environments continuously produce. The marketing implications of this are staggering, and they have never been adequately theorized. Consider what ambient cultural fluency actually provides. At the most basic level, it provides code switching capability, the ability to adjust one's communication style, physical presentation, humor, and social register to match the norms of the environment one is operating in. But ambient cultural fluency goes beyond mere code switching. Code switching is a conscious, effortful process that individuals deploy strategically. Ambient cultural fluency is unconscious. It is embedded in the individual's default operating parameters. It is not something Kelce turns on and off. It is the baseline from which he operates. When he speaks, his cadence, his vocabulary, his humor, and his physical expressiveness reflect the composite cultural environment in which those communicative patterns were formed. He does not sound like a white man performing blackness. He does not sound like a white man performing whiteness. He sounds like a man from Cleveland Heights, which is to say, he sounds like a product of an environment where the boundaries between racial cultural norms were porous enough to produce hybrid communicative styles that do not map neatly onto any single demographic category. This hybrid communicative style is, from a marketing perspective, an extraordinarily rare asset. The vast majority of professional athletes communicate within the cultural registers of their demographic backgrounds. A white quarterback from rural Texas speaks and presents in ways that are legible to white rural American audiences. A black wide receiver from South Florida speaks and presents in ways that are legible to black urban American audiences. These are not limitations. They are natural expressions of the environments that formed those individuals, but they do limit the cultural surface area of the brand that can be constructed around those individuals. The athlete, who communicates within a single cultural register, can be marketed effectively to the audiences that share that register, but marketing him to audiences outside of it requires translation, which introduces friction, which reduces reach, which ultimately caps the ceiling on brand value. Kelce does not face this constraint. His communicative style, because it was formed in a diversity ecology, already contains the codes of multiple cultural audiences. He does not need to be translated for black audiences or for white audiences or for multiracial audiences. He's already legible to all of them, not because he is neutral or generic, but because his baseline communicative register is itself a composite of the cultural norms those audiences recognize as their own. Cleveland Heights also provided something that is even less frequently discussed in marketing literature: exposure to the specific cultural institution of black male style. This requires a brief historical excavation. Cleveland and its surrounding suburbs were major destinations during the Great Migration, the decades-long movement of black Americans from the rural South to urban centers in the North and Midwest that reshaped the demographic landscape of American cities in the early to mid-20th century. The black communities that established themselves in the greater Cleveland area brought with them cultural traditions that had been forged under conditions of extreme exclusion from mainstream American institutions. One of these traditions was the cultivation of personal appearance as a form of institutional resistance and self-assertion. When black men were excluded from the boardrooms, courtrooms, and country clubs of white America, they constructed alternative systems of status, signaling that centered on dress, grooming, and physical presentation. The black church tradition, in which Sunday dress represented not merely religious observance, but a weekly performance of dignity, respectability, and self-worth in the face of structural dehumanization, was one manifestation of this. The black fraternity tradition, particularly organizations like Kappa Alpha Psi, which placed explicit emphasis on personal presentation as a core organizational value, was another. The broader culture of black male style, in which the ability to dress well was understood not as vanity, but as a form of social literacy, was the most pervasive expression of this tradition. Travis Kelce grew up adjacent to this tradition. He did not grow up inside it in the way that a black child in Cleveland Heights would have, absorbing it as an ancestral cultural inheritance. But he grew up close enough to it in a community where 40% of his neighbors were black, where his teammates and classmates and friends were black, where the ambient cultural data of his daily life included constant exposure to the aesthetic norms and style codes of black male presentation, that the tradition became part of his own cultural operating system. He did not have to seek it out. It was simply there, in the same way that the English language was there, or the rules of football were there, or the social norms of suburban Midwestern life were there. It was part of the environment, and the environment does not ask permission before it imprints itself on the individuals who are formed within it. The implications for his eventual marketing trajectory are profound. When Kelce later began to dress in ways that resonated with black female audiences, as this case study will explore in subsequent sections, he was not making a calculated branding decision. He was expressing preferences and sensibilities that had been formed in Cleveland Heights, in a community where the aesthetic vocabulary of black male style was part of the ambient cultural landscape. The intentionality question, whether Kelce deliberately cultivated a cross-racial brand or simply expressed the cultural composite that his upbringing produced, is ultimately less important than the structural observation that Cleveland Heights equipped him with the raw materials for such a brand. The environment did the work. The marketing emerged as a consequence, not a cause. It is also critical to note what Cleveland Heights did not provide. It did not provide wealth. The Kelce family was not affluent. Travis's parents, Ed and Donna Kelce, are divorced, and the family's circumstances were described by his high school coaches as humble. His high school football coach, Mike Jones, emphasized that Travis came from humble beginnings and had hurdles to overcome. He was not handed his opportunities. This matters because the absence of wealth, combined with the presence of diversity, creates a specific motivational architecture. The individual who grows up in a diverse environment without significant financial resources develops an acute awareness of the ways in which social and cultural capital can substitute for financial capital. He learns, tacitly, that the ability to navigate multiple social environments, to read multiple sets of cultural codes, to present oneself in ways that are legible to multiple audiences, has tangible economic value. He does not learn this as a theory. He learns it as a survival strategy, as a means of accessing opportunities that would otherwise be foreclosed to someone of his socioeconomic background. Consider as well the specific athletic ecosystem of Cleveland Heights High School. Kelce was a three-sport athlete, playing football, basketball, and baseball. He was the starting quarterback on the football team, lettering for 3 years. He was on the basketball roster. He played baseball with enough seriousness to be noted by his coaches. In a community that is roughly 40% black, the athletic teams at Cleveland Heights High School would have reflected that demographic composition. This means that Kelce's primary peer group during his formative adolescent years, the cohort of young men with whom he spent the most intensive and emotionally significant hours of his daily life, was not monolithically white. It was racially mixed in proportions that roughly mirrored the community itself. The locker room, the practice field, the team bus, the weight room, these are spaces of extraordinary social intimacy for adolescent males. They are spaces where social hierarchies are negotiated, where cultural norms are transmitted, where humor and language and style are calibrated through constant peer interaction. Kelce spent thousands of hours in these spaces with young men from multiple racial backgrounds, and those hours constituted the most intensive cultural training program that any marketing strategist could design, except that no one designed it. It was simply the product of geography. Former Cleveland Heights athletic director Joe D'Amato noted that the school follows Kelce's flair for apparel and style, suggesting that even the institution itself recognized the cultural vocabulary that had been built in their halls. The school felt it looked good because it absorbed something from what Kelce represented. This is a remarkable admission when read through the lens of this case study. It suggests that the cultural training Kelce received at Cleveland Heights was not a one-way transmission. It was an ecosystem, a feedback loop in which the community produced a culturally fluent individual who then reflected that fluency back to the community in amplified form. The school that formed him now cites him as a style reference. The suburb that equipped him with ambient cultural fluency now points to him as evidence of its own cultural sophistication. This is what marketing theorists call brand amplification through origin narrative, and it operates in Kelce's case with a naturalness and authenticity that no manufactured brand story could replicate. The final dimension of the Cleveland Heights incubator that must be addressed is its position within the broader geography of northern Ohio. Cleveland Heights is not Cleveland. It is a suburb, which means it participates in the cultural life of the city without being fully embedded in the city's most concentrated demographic zones. This suburban positioning is itself a form of cultural mediation. It places the individual close enough to urban cultural production to absorb its outputs, but distant enough to maintain the cross-demographic social networks that a more homogeneous urban environment might not provide. Kelce did not grow up in a predominantly black neighborhood in Cleveland. He grew up in a racially mixed suburb where the cultural outputs of black Cleveland were accessible but not overwhelming, where they could be absorbed alongside the cultural outputs of white suburban America, Asian American academic culture, and the other demographic strands that Cleveland Heights contains. This positioning is optimal for the development of the kind of cultural fluency that produces maximum marketing versatility. It produces an individual who is conversant in multiple cultural languages without being native to any single one, which is precisely the linguistic profile of the most effective translators, mediators, and brand ambassadors. Cleveland Heights, then, is not merely the place where Travis Kelce grew up. It is the first and most important piece of technology in the marketing system that he would become. It provided ambient cultural fluency. It provided exposure to black male style traditions. It provided the motivational architecture of modest means in a diverse environment. It provided thousands of hours of immersive cross-racial socialization through team sports. And it provided all of this without any conscious design or strategic intent, which is what makes it so powerful as a marketing input. The most authentic brand stories are the ones that were never meant to be brand stories at all. They are the ones that emerge organically from the structural conditions of an individual's formation. Cleveland Heights did not set out to produce a marketing technology. It set out to be a community where people from different backgrounds lived alongside one another. That it produced Travis Kelce is a consequence of its own structural properties, properties that this case study argues are replicable, analyzable, and far more determinative of marketing outcomes than any deliberate branding strategy could ever be. One must also consider the temporal dimension of Kelce's formation in Cleveland Heights. He graduated from the high school in 2008, which places his most formative adolescent years in the mid-2000s, a period of significant cultural transition in America. This was the era in which hip-hop had fully consolidated its position as the dominant cultural force in American youth culture, cutting across racial lines in ways that earlier iterations of the genre had not. It was the era in which social media was in its infancy, which meant that cultural transmission still occurred primarily through face-to-face interaction, rather than through the mediated, algorithmically curated channels that would come to dominate cultural exchange in the 2010s. For a young white male in Cleveland Heights during this period, the cultural inputs were arriving not through a screen, but through lived experience, through the actual physical proximity of peers whose cultural reference points, musical tastes, fashion sensibilities, and communicative styles reflected the full spectrum of the community's demographic composition. This form of cultural acquisition, unmediated by technology, unfiltered by algorithmic curation, is qualitatively different from the kind of cultural exposure that a young person growing up in the same community today would receive. It is slower, deeper, and more durable. It imprints at the level of habit and instinct rather than at the level of trend and performance. And it is this depth of imprinting that gives Kelce's cultural fluency its extraordinary authenticity, the quality that audiences detect and respond to, even when they cannot articulate what they are detecting. The tight end position in the National Football League operates as one of the most consequential sorting mechanisms in American professional sports, and yet its function as a psychological and cultural incubator has never been adequately examined. The standard scouting narrative treats the tight end as a hybrid position, one that demands the blocking ability of an offensive lineman and the route-running precision of a wide receiver. This description is accurate at the level of on-field function, but it is catastrophically incomplete as a description of the human being who plays the position because it omits the single most important variable in the tight end equation, the sport the player left behind. The tight end pipeline, as this case study terms it, is the informal but remarkably consistent pathway that moves male athletes from basketball to football, from the court to the tight end room, and from one set of cultural expectations to an entirely different one. Travis Kelce is a product of this pipeline, and understanding the pipeline is essential to understanding the marketing technology he would become. The statistical evidence for the pipeline is overwhelming. Antonio Gates, arguably the most famous example, played basketball at Kent State University and never played a single down of college football before being signed as an undrafted free agent by the San Diego Chargers, where he became one of the greatest tight ends in NFL history. Jimmy Graham played basketball at the University of Miami, where he started as a power forward before walking onto the football team and eventually becoming a first-round draft pick. Tony Gonzalez played basketball at the University of California, Berkeley, appearing in the NCAA tournament before committing fully to football. Julius Thomas played basketball at Portland State before converting to tight end. The list extends further, encompassing dozens of current and former NFL tight ends whose athletic biographies include significant basketball experience at the high school or collegiate level. The pattern is so consistent that it constitutes an unwritten but structurally operative pipeline, a positional migration route that is driven not by coaching strategy or institutional design, but by the anthropometric realities of the male body in the 6'3" to 6'6", 230 to 260 pound range. What happens when a body in this range enters the basketball ecosystem? In high school, it dominates. A 6'5", 240 pound athlete with above average vertical explosiveness and large hands is a physically overwhelming presence on a high school basketball court. He can rebound over smaller players. He can score in the post through sheer physical superiority. He can alter shots at the rim simply by being larger than his opponents. The positive reinforcement is enormous. The athlete receives attention, accolades, and validation from coaches, peers, and family members. Basketball, at the high school level, appears to be his sport. The court feels like home. The identity of basketball player becomes deeply encoded in the athlete's self-concept. But then the competitive landscape shifts. At the Division I collegiate level, the 6'5" body with a +3 wingspan is no longer physically overwhelming. It is, at best, adequate. The power forwards at this level are 6'7" with +5 wingspans and 8% body fat. The centers are 6'10" with +7 wingspans and movement skills that would have been unimaginable a generation ago. The athlete who dominated in high school suddenly finds himself in a positional no man's land. He is too short to play the 4 or the 5 against Division I competition. He is too heavy and too slow laterally to play the 3. He is not a guard. The basketball identity that was so deeply encoded begins to fracture, not because the athlete has failed, but because the competitive environment has revealed the structural limitations of his anthropometric profile. This fracture produces what this case study terms positional melancholy, a persistent, low-grade psychological orientation toward the sport and the identity that the athlete was forced to leave behind. Positional melancholy is not clinical depression. It is not a pathology. It is a form of ambient longing that shapes the athlete's relationship to status, aesthetics, visibility, and cultural belonging for the remainder of his career and, in many cases, for the remainder of his life. The athlete who experiences positional melancholy does not walk around in a state of sadness. He walks around in a state of dual orientation. One part of his identity is committed to the sport he currently plays, the sport that his body is optimized for, the sport that pays his salary and structures his daily existence. Another part of his identity remains oriented toward the sport he left, the sport that offered a different kind of cultural currency, a different kind of visibility, a different relationship to style, media, and public perception. The evidence for positional melancholy is visible across the NFL, and the Myles Garrett example is perhaps the most striking. Garrett, who plays defensive end for the Cleveland Browns at 6'4" and 272 pounds, has repeatedly appeared at Cleveland Cavaliers games, participating in fan activities during timeouts, attending slam dunk exhibitions, and generally demonstrating a level of engagement with basketball culture that far exceeds what would be expected from a professional football player. Garrett's football contract is worth tens of millions of dollars annually. His body is insured for sums that make recreational basketball a statistically irrational activity, and yet he cannot stay away from the basketball court. He is drawn to it not by rational calculation, but by positional melancholy, by the residual orientation toward a sport that his body could not fully realize, but that his psychological and cultural identity never fully abandoned. For Travis Kelce, positional melancholy takes on specific dimensions that are directly relevant to his marketing trajectory. His basketball experience at Cleveland Heights High School placed him in a sporting environment that, in the mid-2000s, in a community that was roughly 40% black, was deeply inflected by black athletic and cultural norms. Basketball in America is not merely a sport. It is a cultural ecosystem with its own aesthetic traditions, communicative styles, fashion norms, and social hierarchies. The basketball court in a racially diverse high school is one of the most culturally complex social spaces that an American adolescent can inhabit. It is a space where physical hierarchy, racial dynamics, aesthetic preferences, and social status all intersect and interact in real time. The white male athlete who participates in this space, particularly one who is physically competitive enough to earn a roster spot in playing time, is exposed to cultural data of extraordinary density and complexity. He learns how black teammates communicate with one another. He learns what shoes are considered stylish and why. He learns the gestural vocabulary of basketball culture, the specific ways in which players celebrate, commiserate, express confidence, and signal respect. He absorbs all of this, not as an observer, but as a participant, which means the learning is embodied, stored not merely in memory, but in muscle and reflex, in the habitual patterns of physical and social behavior. When this athlete transitions to the tight end position in football, he carries all of this embodied cultural knowledge with him. But he carries it into a position that does not, by default, provide the same kind of cultural visibility or aesthetic freedom that basketball provided. The tight end position in football is, in the hierarchy of positional glamour, significantly lower than the positions the athlete may have coveted in basketball. Tight ends are not featured in highlight reels with the same frequency as wide receivers or running backs. They do not have the cultural cachet of quarterbacks. They are, in many respects, the utility players of the offensive formation, valued for their versatility but not celebrated for their individuality. This creates a tension within the athlete between the cultural expectations of his current position and the cultural orientation he carries from his previous sport. The positional melancholy of the former basketball player manifests in the tight end position as a persistent drive to transcend the positional constraints, to find alternative channels of visibility, expression, and cultural engagement that the position itself does not naturally provide. This drive is the psychological engine that powers many of the most significant marketing developments in Kelce's career. When he cultivates a personal style that is more elaborate and culturally coded than what is typical for NFL tight ends, he's not merely making a fashion choice. He is expressing the residual cultural orientation of a former basketball player who was formed in a space where style, visibility, and aesthetic self-expression were integral to the sporting experience. When he launches a music festival, appears on talk shows with a physical charisma that seems outsized for a football player, or demonstrates a level of comfort in media environments that is unusual for someone in his position, he is drawing on the communicative repertoire that basketball culture inscribed in him during his formative years. The tight end pipeline does not merely move bodies from one sport to another. It moves cultural operating systems. It moves aesthetic sensibilities. It moves psychological orientations toward visibility and self-expression. And it moves all of these things into a professional context, the NFL tight end room, that is uniquely positioned to benefit from them because the tight end room sits at the intersection of the offensive line, which is culturally invisible, and the skill positions, which are culturally prominent. The suspension at the University of Cincinnati adds another layer to this analysis. Kelce was suspended for the entire 2010 season after testing positive for marijuana during the Sugar Bowl trip to New Orleans. His scholarship was revoked. His future in football was uncertain. His brother Jason, who was also at Cincinnati, took him in providing housing and food while Travis worked to earn his way back onto the team. The standard narrative treats this suspension as a youthful mistake, a character concern that caused him to slip in the NFL draft. But when read through the framework of positional melancholy and the tight end pipeline, the suspension reveals something additional. The marijuana usage, the primary source material for this case study argues, is itself a cultural indicator. In the early 2010s, marijuana use among college athletes was overwhelmingly associated with social and recreational contexts that were predominantly black. The substance operated as a social drug consumed in group settings among peer networks. For a white athlete to test positive for marijuana in this context suggests not merely that he used the substance, but that he was embedded in social networks where its use was normative, where the cultural codes around its consumption were familiar, and where the social setting of its use was structured by the norms of his predominantly black peer group. This is not a moral judgment. It is a sociological observation. The suspension tells us that Kelce's immersion in black athletic and social culture was not superficial. It extended beyond the practice field and the locker room into the recreational and social dimensions of his college experience. He was not performing cultural proximity. He was living it, to a degree that produced real consequences when the behavioral norms of that cultural environment collided with the institutional rules of the athletic program. The suspension, paradoxically, is one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the depth and authenticity of Kelce's cultural immersion, which is precisely the quality that would later make his cross-cultural marketing appeal so effective and so resistant to the charge of inauthenticity. Critically, the suspension also pushed Kelce fully into the tight end room. He had previously split time between tight end and a wildcat quarterback role. The year away from the team and the subsequent need to maximize his draft stock in a compressed timeline forced him to commit entirely to the tight end position. This is the moment at which the tight end pipeline completes its work. The The basketball player who became a multi-position football player is now, irrevocably, a tight end. The positional melancholy crystallizes. The cultural operating system imported from basketball and from Cleveland Heights is now housed permanently within a position that will serve as the platform for everything that follows. The suspension, far from being a setback, was the catalytic event that locked Kelce into the precise positional framework from which his marketing potential could be most effectively realized. Had he continued as a Wildcat quarterback, his cultural visibility and positional identity would have been diffused across multiple roles. By becoming exclusively a tight end, he became a single, coherent platform on which the entire marketing architecture could be constructed. The pipeline also produced in Kelce a specific relationship to self-optimization that deserves examination. The athlete who transitions from basketball to football does not merely change sports. He changes the relationship between his body and the competitive environment. In basketball, the body's limitations are visible and immediate. The player who is too short or too heavy for his position knows it every time he is scored on by a taller opponent or beaten on the perimeter by a quicker one. The feedback loop is relentless and public. In football, the relationship between body and competition is mediated by equipment, by scheme, by the collective nature of the sport. The tight end can compensate for physical limitations through technique, through film study, through understanding of defensive alignments. This shift from transparent physical competition to mediated technical competition produces a mindset of optimization. The athlete begins to think systematically about how to maximize the output of his body. He studies nutrition, he studies recovery, he studies supplementation. He approaches his body as a system to be engineered rather than a gift to be exercised. This optimization mindset, which the primary source material identifies as a characteristic pattern among white athletes in ultra-competitive sports environments, extends beyond athletic performance into every dimension of the athlete's life. It informs how he dresses, it informs how he presents himself in media settings, it informs how he evaluates and selects romantic partners. It informs, ultimately, how he constructs and deploys the marketing identity that his body, his position, and his cultural formation have made possible. The tight end pipeline, then, is not merely a positional pathway. It is a comprehensive formation system that produces athletes with a specific combination of psychological, cultural, and cognitive attributes. It produces individuals who carry positional melancholy, which drives them toward forms of cultural expression that transcend their on-field roles. It produces individuals with cross-sport cultural fluency who have been immersed in the aesthetic and communicative norms of basketball culture and carry those norms into football. It produces individuals with an optimization mindset who approach their bodies and their brands as systems to be engineered. And it produces all of this within a positional context, the tight end room, that sits at the precise intersection of cultural invisibility and cultural possibility within the NFL. Travis Kelce is the most complete expression of the tight end pipeline's marketing potential that the NFL has ever produced. His body, his background, his suspension, and his positional identity all converge to create a platform of extraordinary cultural versatility. The pipeline built the technology. The market simply had not yet recognized what it had produced. The University of Cincinnati itself deserves attention as a formation environment. Cincinnati is a city that sits at the border of the Midwest and the Upper South, a geographic position that produces cultural dynamics distinct from either region in isolation. The university's football program, during Kelce's tenure, from 2008 through 2012, was competitive at the highest level of non-Power 5 football. It recruited athletes from Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, and the broader Midwest, a recruiting footprint that produced rosters with significant racial diversity. The team's trip to the Sugar Bowl in New Orleans for the 2010 game, the trip during which Kelce's positive marijuana test occurred, is itself a culturally significant data point. New Orleans is one of the most culturally dense cities in America, a place where Black cultural traditions in music, food, dress, and social interaction are not merely present but dominant. The exposure to New Orleans, even in the compressed time frame of a bowl game trip, would have constituted an intensification of the cultural immersion that Kelce was already experiencing through his team environment. The marijuana test, occurring during this trip, suggests that the social dynamics of the team's recreational activities in New Orleans followed the cultural norms of the predominantly Black peer group rather than the norms that might have governed a similar group of predominantly white college athletes. The coaching transition also matters. Kelce arrived at Cincinnati under Coach Brian Kelly and experienced his suspension under Coach Butch Jones. The roster management decisions, the team culture, the social dynamics of the program, all of these were shaped by coaching philosophies that determined which athletes were recruited, how they interacted, and what behavioral norms were enforced or tolerated. The fact that Kelce's scholarship was revoked and that he had to earn his way back onto the team through his brother Jason's advocacy and through demonstrating behavioral compliance, including sessions with a therapist, suggests an institutional response that was punitive but not permanent. The program valued Kelce's athletic potential enough to allow a pathway back, and the pathway required him to demonstrate the kind of institutional legibility, the ability to present oneself as reformed, compliant, and committed that would later serve him well in the far more complex institutional environment of the NFL. The position change that followed the suspension is perhaps the most consequential athletic decision in this entire narrative. By committing fully to the tight end position, Kelce entered a formation environment, the tight end room, that was smaller, more intimate, and more cross-positionally connected than any other position group on the roster. Tight end rooms in college football typically contain 4 to 8 players, compared to the 12 to 15 players in a wide receiver room, or the 10 to 12 in an offensive line room. This smaller group size intensifies the interpersonal dynamics and accelerates the cultural exchange that occurs within the group. The tight end room is also, by nature of the position's hybrid role, connected to both the offensive line meetings and the passing game meetings, which means the tight end is exposed to a broader range of teammates and coaching perspectives than players at more siloed positions. This cross-positional exposure mirrors, at the football level, the cross-cultural exposure that Cleveland Heights provided at the community level. The tight end is, structurally, a bridge position, and the individual who plays it is formed, whether he recognizes it or not, as a bridge person, someone whose default mode of operation is to connect, translate, and navigate between different groups. This bridge identity, forged in the tight end room at Cincinnati and reinforced over 12 NFL seasons in Kansas City, is the positional foundation of Kelce's marketing architecture. The National Football League is, by its demographic composition, one of the most racially distinctive professional environments in America. Approximately 57% of NFL players are black. Approximately 25% are white. The remainder is distributed among players of Hispanic, Pacific Islander, Asian, and multiracial backgrounds. But these aggregate figures obscure a more structurally consequential reality. Racial composition varies dramatically by position. White players are concentrated in a remarkably narrow band of positions. They predominate at offensive line, where the percentage of white players has historically hovered between 60 and 70%. They constitute the majority of quarterbacks, though this percentage has been declining. They represent a significant portion of tight ends, and they are sparsely represented at virtually every other position. The skill positions, wide receiver, running back, and cornerback, are overwhelmingly populated by black athletes. The defensive line and linebacker positions skew heavily black. The safety position is predominantly black. This positional segregation, which has been documented extensively in sports sociology literature, means that the white player's experience of the NFL is fundamentally structured by which position he plays, because his position determines the racial composition of his most immediate peer group. For Travis Kelce, this structural reality produces a specific and marketing relevant outcome. As a tight end, he is positioned within the offensive formation adjacent to 3 groups: the offensive line, which is predominantly white, the wide receivers, who are predominantly black, and the quarterback, whose racial identity varies. In the locker room, in the meeting rooms, in the weight room, and in the social spaces of the team, the tight end occupies a liminal positional identity. He is not fully an offensive lineman. He is not fully a skill position player. He is both and neither, which means his social network within the team naturally spans the racial divide that positional segregation creates. He eats meals with offensive linemen who may share his racial background and with wide receivers who may not. He participates in pass-catching drills with receivers and in blocking drills with linemen. He is, by positional design, a social bridge between 2 culturally distinct subgroups within the team. This bridging function is not merely social, it is ethnographic. The tight end, who spans the positional and racial divide within an NFL team, is, whether he recognizes it or not, conducting a form of participant observation that anthropologists would recognize as fieldwork. He is embedded in a social environment that contains multiple cultural systems. He observes the norms of each system from a position of proximity and participation. He absorbs information about how different groups communicate, what they value, how they present themselves, and what cultural codes they deploy to signal status, belonging, and identity. And he absorbs all of this information continuously over the course of seasons that last from July through January or February in environments of extraordinary physical and emotional intensity. The NFL locker room is not a casual social space. It is a pressure cooker in which individuals spend more waking hours with their teammates than with their families. The bonds formed in this environment are forged under conditions of shared physical suffering, shared competitive anxiety, and shared emotional investment. The information exchanged in this environment is not superficial. It is the deep cultural data of how men from different backgrounds navigate the world, presented without filter or curation, in a context where authenticity is enforced by the constant proximity of peers who will immediately detect and penalize performative behavior. For a white tight end in this environment, the cultural data flowing from black teammates is of particular significance. The black athletes on an NFL team, particularly those in skill positions, tend to represent the most culturally expressive segment of the roster. This is not a stereotype. It is a structural observation rooted in the cultural traditions examined in Section 2 of this case study. Black American culture has historically placed greater emphasis on personal style, verbal artistry, and physical expressiveness as forms of social capital. This emphasis is not innate. It is the product of historical conditions in which alternative forms of status expression were developed in response to exclusion from mainstream economic and institutional avenues of advancement. The wide receiver who wears custom designer clothing to team meetings is not merely expressing personal preference. He is participating in a cultural tradition that extends back generations through the era of the Black Dandy, through the Harlem Renaissance, through the Civil Rights Movement's emphasis on presentable appearance, through the hip-hop generation's transformation of fashion into a medium of cultural resistance and self-assertion. Kelce, embedded in this environment 6 to 7 months per year over the course of what is now 12 NFL seasons, has been exposed to an extraordinarily concentrated and sustained stream of Black cultural data. He has witnessed, up close and over extended periods, how his Black teammates dress, how they speak to one another in private, what music they listen to, what cultural references they deploy, what aesthetic standards they apply to their own appearance and to the appearance of others. He has been present for conversations about fashion, about grooming, about what constitutes an attractive or aspirational presentation. He has absorbed the subtle hierarchies of style that exist within the Black male athletic community, where the quality of one's wardrobe, the precision of one's haircut, and the coherence of one's overall aesthetic are evaluated with a specificity and rigor that has no parallel in white male athletic culture. This sustained exposure produces what this case study terms cultural fluency through immersion saturation, the point at which the volume and duration of cultural exposure are sufficient to transform the observer into a participant who can deploy the observed cultural codes without conscious effort. Kelce reached this threshold not through any deliberate process of cultural study, but through the sheer accumulation of years spent in close proximity to Black cultural expression within the NFL environment. The fashion choices that would later define his public image, the tailored suits, the bold patterns, the accessories that signal awareness of trends originating in Black fashion communities are not the product of a marketing consultant's recommendations. They are the natural output of a cultural operating system that was built incrementally, year by year, through daily exposure to the aesthetic norms of his Black teammates. It is essential to understand what makes the NFL locker room a more effective site of cultural transmission than any other professional environment in America. First, the level of physical intimacy is unmatched. NFL players dress and undress in shared spaces. They shower together. They receive medical treatment in communal training rooms. They travel together, eat together, and in many cases live in close proximity to one another during training camp. This level of physical intimacy breaks down the social barriers that normally mediate cross-racial interaction in professional settings. There is no performance of professional distance in the locker room. There is only the raw, unmediated reality of human bodies in close quarters, which produces a form of social bonding that is deeper and more culturally permeable than anything available in a corporate office, a university campus, or any other professional environment. Second, the emotional intensity of the NFL experience amplifies the depth of cultural transmission. When teammates share the physical suffering of training camp, the anxiety of game preparation, the euphoria of victory, and the devastation of defeat, the bonds formed between them are not merely professional, they are existential. Men who have shared these experiences together develop a form of trust and openness that allows for the exchange of cultural information that would be off limits in less intense social contexts. A Black teammate may share perspectives on race, identity, and cultural experience with a white teammate in the NFL locker room that he would never share in a corporate meeting or a casual social gathering, because the locker room has already established a baseline of mutual vulnerability that makes such exchanges possible. Third, the duration of exposure is extraordinary. An NFL career lasts, on average, approximately 3 to 4 years. Kelce has been in the league for 12 seasons and counting. This means he has spent more than a decade immersed in the culturally dense environment of the NFL locker room, accumulating cultural data at a rate and with a consistency that few other professional environments could provide. The compound effect of 12 years of daily immersion in this environment is not a marginal increase in cultural awareness. It is a fundamental transformation of the individual's cultural operating system, a transformation so complete that the cultural codes he acquired through immersion have become indistinguishable from the cultural codes he inherited from his own background. The Kansas City Chiefs organization adds another layer to this analysis. The Chiefs, during Kelce's tenure, have been built around Patrick Mahomes, a Black and multiracial quarterback who is himself one of the most culturally visible athletes in America. The Chiefs' offensive core has included Tyreek Hill, a Black wide receiver of extraordinary dynamism and cultural expressiveness, Travis Kelce himself, and a rotating cast of skill position players who are predominantly Black. The defensive side of the ball has featured players like Chris Jones, a Black defensive tackle with a significant cultural and media profile. The team's culture, shaped by the personalities of these individuals and by the organizational ethos established by head coach Andy Reid, has been characterized by a level of cultural expressiveness and individual personality that is unusual even by NFL standards. The Chiefs' locker room is not a buttoned-down corporate environment. It is a culturally vibrant space where individual expression is encouraged and where the cultural norms of the predominantly black roster are the dominant cultural norms of the team. For Kelce, this means that the cultural immersion architecture of the NFL has been amplified by the specific organizational culture of the team he plays for. He has not merely been immersed in black cultural norms at the league level, he has been immersed in them at the team level, in an organization where those norms are celebrated rather than suppressed, where individual expression is valued rather than constrained, and where the most culturally visible and expressive players are also the most successful and influential. This creates a feedback loop in which cultural fluency is not merely tolerated but rewarded. The player who can navigate the cultural norms of the locker room, who can participate authentically in the cultural life of the team, who can deploy the communicative and aesthetic codes of his teammates with fluency and confidence, is not merely accepted. He is elevated. He becomes a cultural node within the team, a point of connection between different social groups, a figure who is valued not only for his on-field production, but for his ability to knit the social fabric of the organization together. This is the role that Kelce has occupied within the Chiefs for more than a decade. He is the team's cultural bridge, the player who can move seamlessly between the offensive line group and the skill position group, between the white minority and the black majority, between the norms of football culture and the norms of broader American culture. This bridging role is not a formal designation. It is an emergent property of his positional identity, his anthropometric profile, his background in Cleveland Heights, and his 12 years of immersive cultural exposure in the NFL. And it is this bridging role, more than any individual style choice or marketing decision, that constitutes the foundation of his extraordinary marketability. The man who can bridge cultures can be marketed to all of them. The man who is fluent in multiple cultural codes can resonate with audiences that no single culture athlete can reach. The man whose cultural operating system was built through sustained immersion in the most culturally dense and emotionally intense professional environment in America is not merely an athlete with a personal brand. He is a marketing technology, a human instrument capable of transmitting and translating cultural signals across demographic boundaries with an efficiency and authenticity that no manufactured brand campaign could replicate. The locker room, in the end, is the second great incubator. Cleveland Heights provided the ambient cultural fluency, the tight end pipeline provided the psychological orientation and the positional platform. The NFL locker room provided the 12-year advanced program in cultural immersion that transformed ambient fluency into operational mastery. Each layer of this formation system builds on the last, compounding the cultural capital that Kelce carries with him into every public appearance, every brand partnership, every media interaction, and ultimately every romantic relationship. The architecture was not designed, it was accumulated, and it is this accumulated, organic quality that makes it so devastatingly effective as a marketing foundation, because the market can always detect the difference between a brand that was built and a person who was formed. It is worth dwelling on the specific mechanics of how information transfers in the NFL locker room, because the mechanics determine the quality and durability of the cultural knowledge acquired. In a corporate environment, cultural information is exchanged through formal channels, presentations, training sessions, written communications, organized social events. These channels are filtered. They carry information that has been curated, sanitized, and packaged for consumption by individuals outside the source culture. The cultural information acquired through these channels is, correspondingly, superficial. It provides awareness without fluency, knowledge without instinct, familiarity without belonging. In the NFL locker room, by contrast, cultural information is exchanged through informal, unfiltered, often unconscious channels. It is exchanged through conversation between teammates standing at adjacent lockers. It is exchanged through the music that plays over the speaker system during warm-ups and workouts, music that is selected by the players themselves and reflects their cultural preferences without institutional mediation. It is exchanged through the food that players bring into the facility, through the streaming content they watch on their phones during downtime, through the phone conversations their teammates have in their presence, through the jokes they tell and the stories they share and the arguments they have about which pair of sneakers is superior and why. This last example, the argument about sneakers, is more consequential than it might appear. Sneaker culture, which originated in Black American communities and has become a multi-billion-dollar global industry, is one of the most culturally dense and semiotically complex consumer domains in the world. A man's choice of sneakers communicates his awareness of cultural trends, his economic status, his aesthetic sophistication, and his connection to specific subcultural communities. The conversation about sneakers in an NFL locker room is beneath its casual surface, a conversation about cultural literacy, economic signaling, and aesthetic hierarchy. The white tight end who participates in this conversation over the course of 12 NFL seasons does not merely learn which sneakers are considered desirable. He internalizes the evaluative framework through which desirability is determined. He learns that desirability in sneaker culture is not primarily a function of price or brand prestige. It is a function of cultural significance, of the specific narrative that a particular shoe carries, of the community from which it emerged, and of the moment in cultural history that it represents. This evaluative framework, once internalized, becomes portable. It can be applied not only to sneakers, but to clothing, to watches, to cars, to interior design, to every domain of consumer choice. The locker room sneaker conversation is, in effect, a masterclass in cultural semiotics, delivered informally and continuously over a decade, to an individual whose ambient cultural fluency from Cleveland Heights made him uniquely receptive to its lessons. The role of music in the NFL locker room deserves similar attention. The soundtrack of the NFL locker room is overwhelmingly hip-hop and R&B, genres that are rooted in Black American cultural production and that carry with them entire ecosystems of cultural information, lyrical references to specific neighborhoods, brands, experiences, and social dynamics, production styles that reflect the aesthetic sensibilities of specific regions and eras, artist personas that embody particular approaches to masculinity, wealth, and social power. The white tight end who listens to this music daily for years in the company of teammates who possess the cultural literacy to interpret and discuss it at a granular level acquires a form of musical literacy that extends well beyond personal preference. He learns the cultural genealogies that connect artists to movements, movements to communities, and communities to the broader narrative of Black American cultural production. This musical literacy, like sneaker literacy and fashion literacy, becomes a component of his overall cultural operating system, informing his aesthetic choices, his communicative style, and his ability to signal cultural awareness in public contexts. The physical dimension of NFL cultural immersion also warrants further exploration. Professional football is a sport in which physical contact is not incidental but constitutive. The game itself is defined by collision, and the preparation for the game involves forms of physical interaction, blocking drills, tackling drills, wrestling exercises that require sustained body-to-body contact between teammates. This physical intimacy, which occurs across racial lines daily and without ceremony, breaks down a barrier that remains firmly in place in most other American professional environments, the barrier of physical proximity. In corporate America, in academia, in media, cross-racial physical contact is minimized, managed, and often avoided entirely. In the NFL, it is mandatory. The white tight end who blocks against a black defensive end in practice, who is helped off the ground by a black linebacker after being knocked down, who receives massage therapy in a training room alongside black teammates, who sits shoulder to shoulder with black teammates on a bus for hours, develops a level of physical comfort with cross-racial proximity that fundamentally alters the way he moves through the world. He does not carry the physical stiffness or spatial awkwardness that many white Americans unconsciously exhibit in cross-racial settings. He moves with an ease and a naturalness that communicates, at a level far below conscious perception, that he belongs in these spaces. This physical ease is one of the most subtle and most powerful components of Kelce's cross-cultural brand. It is visible in every public appearance, every media interaction, every social event. It communicates a comfort with diversity that no marketing strategy can manufacture and no media training can teach. It can only be acquired through years of the kind of physical intimacy that the NFL locker room uniquely provides. There is a dimension of clothing that operates entirely below the threshold of conscious perception for most consumers, and it is this dimension that constitutes one of the most powerful and least understood mechanisms in Travis Kelce's marketing architecture. Clothing, in the framework being developed in this case study, does not merely cover the body. It transmits information, it broadcasts cultural affiliation, economic status, aesthetic literacy, and social aspiration through a system of signals that are legible to some audiences and completely invisible to others. This is not metaphor. It is the operational reality of how garments function in the cultural marketplace, and understanding it is essential to understanding how Kelce transformed his cultural fluency into measurable brand value. The central argument of this section is that Travis Kelce, whether through deliberate strategy or unconscious expression of his culturally composite formation, began to dress for the black female gaze, and that this decision, or this tendency, constituted one of the most consequential marketing moves in modern professional sports. To understand what dressing for the black female gaze means, one must first understand what the black female gaze is. The gaze, in cultural theory, refers to the perspective from which an individual or a group evaluates and interprets visual information. The male gaze, as theorized by Laura Mulvey and subsequent feminist scholars, describes the tendency of visual media to present the world from the perspective of a heterosexual male viewer. The white gaze, as theorized by Toni Morrison and others, describes the tendency of American cultural production to center whiteness as the default perspective from which all experience is evaluated. The black female gaze, by extension, is the evaluative perspective of black women, the specific set of aesthetic criteria, cultural values, and visual expectations through which black women assess and respond to the appearance, behavior, and presentation of the people and objects in their visual field. This gaze is not monolithic. It varies by class, by region, by generation, and by individual, but it does contain consistent structural features that can be identified and analyzed. The black female gaze, when directed at male presentation, evaluates several dimensions simultaneously. First, it evaluates grooming. The standard of male grooming within black American culture is, on average, more exacting than the standard that prevails in white American culture. This is a cultural inheritance from the traditions discussed in Section 2, the black church tradition, the fraternity tradition, and the broader culture of black male presentability that emerged as a response to institutional exclusion. A clean, precise haircut is not merely a preference within this evaluative framework. It is a marker of self-respect, social awareness, and attention to detail. Facial hair, when present, is expected to be shaped and maintained. Skincare is not considered vanity, but baseline maintenance. The man who presents himself with grooming precision signals to the black female gaze that he is aware of and responsive to the standards of the community, that he takes himself seriously, and that he is capable of the kind of sustained attention to detail that suggests reliability and competence in other dimensions of life. Second, the black female gaze evaluates fit. The relationship between garment and body is scrutinized with a specificity that has no precise parallel in mainstream white American male fashion culture. Within the evaluative framework of the black female gaze, clothing should demonstrate awareness of the body's proportions, a suit should be tailored, a shirt should sit correctly at the shoulders, pants should break at the appropriate point on the shoe. These are not preferences. They are requirements, legacies of a cultural tradition in which the ability to wear clothing well was one of the few forms of social distinction available to black men in an economy that systematically denied them other forms of distinction. The man whose clothing fits poorly signals either ignorance of these standards or indifference to them, and both signals are evaluated negatively. Third, the black female gaze evaluates cultural literacy. This is the most subtle and most powerful dimension of the evaluation. Cultural literacy, in the context of male fashion, refers to the ability to deploy garments, accessories, colors, and styling choices that communicate awareness of current cultural conversations. It means knowing which designers are relevant. It means understanding the significance of specific color combinations. It means recognizing the difference between a garment that is merely expensive and a garment that is culturally significant. The culturally literate man does not simply buy the most expensive suit on the rack. He selects the suit that communicates the most culturally informed message, and the difference between these two approaches is legible to the black female gaze with a precision that would astonish most observers who are not themselves embedded in this evaluative framework. Travis Kelce, by the time he had accumulated several years of NFL immersion on top of his Cleveland Heights formation, had internalized all three dimensions of this evaluative framework. His public appearances began to reflect a sartorial vocabulary that was calibrated, whether consciously or unconsciously, to the standards of the black female gaze. He wore tailored suits in cuts that emphasized his physical proportions without the boxy, oversized silhouettes that characterized traditional white male athletic dressing. He accessorized with pieces that demonstrated cultural literacy, watches, jewelry, and eyewear that signaled awareness of trends originating in black fashion communities. He maintained a grooming standard that was notably more precise and more consistently executed than what was typical for white NFL players of his era. And he did all of this with a naturalness that suggested not performance but habit, not calculation but instinct, which is the telltale signature of someone whose aesthetic sensibility was formed through immersion rather than instruction. The marketing implications of dressing for the black female gaze are enormous, and they operate through a mechanism that can be described as cognitive non-resolution. When an individual encounters a visual stimulus that does not resolve neatly into their existing categories, that stimulus captures attention in a way that stimuli which do resolve cannot match. This is a well-established principle in perceptual psychology, and it applies directly to the way audiences respond to Kelce's presentation. A white male NFL tight end who dresses in the conventional vocabulary of white American male fashion, khakis, button-downs, standard fit suits, and conservative colors, resolves immediately in the viewer's mind. He is categorized, filed, and forgotten. His appearance confirms existing expectations and generates no additional cognitive processing. But a white male NFL tight end who dresses in a vocabulary that is calibrated to the black female gaze does not resolve. He captures attention precisely because his appearance violates the expected congruence between his racial identity and his aesthetic presentation. The viewer's mind reaches for a category and does not find one. The result is sustained attention, deeper processing, and stronger memory encoding, all of which are the foundational requirements for effective brand building. This cognitive non-resolution operates differently for different audiences. For black female viewers, Kelce's presentation generates a specific form of positive incongruity. Here is a white man who is dressed in a way that demonstrates literacy in their aesthetic framework. The incongruity between his racial identity and his aesthetic presentation is experienced not as confusion, but as flattery, as an implicit acknowledgement that the standards of their gaze are universal rather than parochial, aspirational rather than niche. For white female viewers, Kelce's presentation generates a different form of positive incongruity. Here is a white man who looks different from the white men they are accustomed to seeing, who presents himself with a level of aesthetic sophistication that is unusual in the white male athletic context. The incongruity generates curiosity, which generates attention, which generates engagement. For male viewers of all racial backgrounds, Kelce's presentation generates yet another form of incongruity. Here is a physically imposing professional athlete who is dressed with a level of care and cultural awareness that challenges the conventional association between masculine physical power and sartorial indifference. The incongruity disrupts the expectation that tough men do not care about clothing, and the disruption generates interest. In every case, the mechanism is the same. Kelce's sartorial choices generate attention by failing to resolve into existing categories. This failure to resolve is not a deficit. It is the most valuable property a brand can possess, because it ensures that the brand occupies cognitive real estate that no competitor can claim. No other white male NFL tight end dresses for the black female gaze. No other white male NFL tight end generates the specific combination of cognitive non-resolutions that Kelce's presentation produces. The sartorial signal system is not merely a complement to his marketing architecture. It is a proprietary mechanism that creates a category of one, a competitive position that cannot be replicated by any other player because it requires the specific formation history, the Cleveland Heights diversity ecology, the tight end pipeline, the 12 years of NFL cultural immersion that produced the individual who deploys it. The relationship between the sartorial signal system and Kelce's romantic life also deserves examination. His relationship with Kayla Nicole, a black woman with a significant social media following and a personal brand centered on lifestyle, fashion, and cultural commentary, was not merely a romantic choice. Read through the framework of this case study, it was the logical extension of a sartorial and cultural trajectory that had been building for years. A man who dresses for the black female gaze is, whether he recognizes it or not, calibrating his presentation to attract the approval and attention of black women. When that calibration succeeds, when it generates the positive incongruity responses described above, it is entirely predictable that one of the women whose gaze was successfully engaged would become a romantic partner. The relationship with Kayla Nicole, which will be examined in greater detail in the following section, was not a departure from Kelce's marketing trajectory. It was a confirmation of it, the most tangible evidence that the sartorial signal system was not merely generating attention, but producing real-world outcomes of the most consequential kind. The sartorial signal system also reveals the deeply asymmetric nature of Kelce's marketing architecture. In information theory, an information asymmetry exists when one party in a transaction possesses information that the other party does not. Kelce's fashion choices represent an information asymmetry deployed against the market. The cultural codes he deploys through his clothing are legible to audiences who possess the cultural literacy to read them, and invisible to audiences who do not. Black female audiences see a man who speaks their aesthetic language. White male audiences see a man who dresses well. Football analysts see a tight end with personality. Fashion commentators see an athlete with taste. None of these audiences perceives the full architecture of the signal system. Each reads only the layer that their own cultural literacy equips them to read. And it is this layered legibility, this ability to transmit multiple messages simultaneously to multiple audiences, that makes the sartorial signal system so extraordinarily efficient as a marketing mechanism. One wardrobe generates multiple brand narratives, each tailored to a specific audience, without any of those narratives contradicting the others. This is not merely good marketing, it is information architecture of the highest order, deployed through the medium of fabric, fit, and cultural fluency. The deeper implication of the sartorial signal system is that clothing, in the right hands and on the right body, is itself a form of marketing technology. It is a broadcast system that transmits brand identity continuously in every public appearance, without the need for paid media, press releases, or content creation. Every photograph of Kelce at a public event is, simultaneously, a fashion editorial and a brand advertisement. Every appearance on a red carpet, at a game, at a charity event, or at a music festival is an opportunity for the sartorial signal system to do its work, generating cognitive non-resolution in multiple audiences simultaneously, and thereby accumulating brand equity at a rate that no conventional marketing strategy could match. The clothing is not an accessory to the brand. The clothing is the brand, or more precisely, the clothing is the most visible expression of the cultural operating system that is the brand. And that cultural operating system was built by Cleveland Heights, by the tight end pipeline, and by 12 years of immersion in the most culturally dense professional environment in America. There is also the matter of what specific garments communicate in this system. A slim-cut suit in a bold color, say a deep burgundy or an emerald green, communicates something categorically different from a standard-fit navy suit. The slim cut says awareness of current trends. The bold color says confidence and willingness to be seen. Together, they say cultural fluency that extends beyond the safe conventions of mainstream white American menswear. A statement watch, particularly one from a brand that carries cultural significance in black and hip-hop adjacent fashion communities, communicates knowledge of a specific value system in which timepieces serve as markers of achievement, taste, and belonging to an aspirational class. A pair of sneakers, selected from a collaboration between a heritage brand and a contemporary designer, communicates awareness of the intersection between streetwear and luxury, an intersection that was pioneered and continues to be dominated by black cultural production. Each of these garments, individually, might be dismissed as a simple fashion choice. Together, they constitute a semiotic system of extraordinary complexity and precision, a system that was not designed by a stylist or a brand consultant, but that emerged organically from the cultural formation of the individual who wears it. This organicism, this authenticity of origin, is what makes the system so resistant to replication and so potent as a marketing tool. The market can always detect the difference between a signal and a performance, and Kelce's sartorial choices register as signals because they are expressions of a cultural identity rather than projections of a marketing strategy. The economic literature on signaling theory, pioneered by Michael Spence in his analysis of job market dynamics, provides additional theoretical grounding for the sartorial signal system. Spence argued that in markets characterized by information asymmetry, individuals invest in signals that communicate unobservable qualities to counterparts who lack the information to directly assess those qualities. A college degree, in Spence's framework, signals intellectual ability and work ethic to employers who cannot directly observe those traits. Kelce's clothing operates through an analogous signaling mechanism. His sartorial choices signal cultural fluency, aesthetic sophistication, and cross-demographic social competence to audiences who cannot directly observe these qualities through other channels. The signal is credible precisely because it is costly in the Spencean sense. Dressing for the black female gaze requires genuine cultural knowledge. It cannot be faked, because the audience possessing the evaluative framework, black women with high cultural literacy, will immediately detect inauthentic or poorly executed attempts to deploy their aesthetic codes. The cost of the signal is not monetary. It is informational. It requires the accumulated cultural capital of a Cleveland Heights upbringing, a tight-end pipeline formation, and 12 years of NFL immersion. Without this informational investment, the signal cannot be produced credibly, which is why no other white male NFL player has successfully deployed it. The sartorial signal system also intersects with the concept of taste, as theorized by Pierre Bourdieu in his landmark work, Distinction. Bourdieu argued that taste is not a natural or individual phenomenon, but a socially constructed one, shaped by the conditions of one's upbringing, education, and class position. The individual's taste, which feels personal and instinctive, is in reality a reproduction of the aesthetic norms of the social environments in which that individual was formed. Kelce's taste in clothing is, from a Bourdieuian perspective, a direct reproduction of the aesthetic norms of the multiple social environments that formed him. It contains elements from working-class Cleveland Heights, from the black-style traditions of his community, from the basketball culture of his adolescence, from the NFL locker room culture of his professional career, and from the cross-cultural fashion ecosystem that these environments collectively exposed him to. The result is a composite taste that does not map neatly onto any single class or cultural position, which is precisely what makes it so fascinating and so commercially valuable. It is taste that cannot be classified. An unclassifiable taste generates attention, discussion, and engagement in a way that classifiable taste never can. The gendered dimensions of the sartorial signal system also deserve attention. Male fashion in America operates under a set of constraints that are fundamentally different from the constraints that govern female fashion. The American male is expected to dress in ways that communicate competence, reliability, and restraint. Excessive attention to appearance is culturally penalized in mainstream white American masculinity. The man who dresses too elaborately, who pays too much attention to his clothing, risks being perceived as vain, effeminate, or unserious. These constraints are significantly less operative in black American masculinity, where attention to appearance has a long and culturally valorized history. By dressing within the norms of black male style, Kelce effectively escapes the constraints of mainstream white American male fashion. He's allowed to be more expressive, more elaborate, more visually interesting than a white male athlete who dresses within the norms of his own cultural tradition would be. The black female gaze, by providing an alternative evaluative framework, liberates him from the aesthetic limitations of mainstream white masculinity and grants him access to a register of male self-expression that generates far more cultural interest and brand value. This liberation has implications that extend beyond clothing into every dimension of his public persona. The man who has been liberated from the aesthetic constraints of mainstream white masculinity is also liberated from the communicative constraints that accompany them. He can be more emotionally expressive. He can be more physically demonstrative. He can laugh louder, celebrate harder, and display affection more openly than the norms of restraint-based white masculinity would typically permit. And each of these behavioral liberations generates the same cognitive non-resolution effect that his clothing generates. The audience expects a white male athlete to be emotionally restrained. Kelce is not. The audience expects a white male athlete to be physically reserved in non-athletic contexts. Kelce is not. Each violated expectation captures attention, deepens engagement, and reinforces the brand narrative of a man who operates outside the conventional constraints of his demographic category. The sartorial signal system, in other words, is not merely about clothing. It is the visible expression of a comprehensive liberation from the aesthetic and behavioral constraints of mainstream white American masculinity, a liberation that was made possible by the specific formation history that this case study has documented, and that generates brand value across every dimension of public life. In the architecture of personal branding, romantic partnerships are rarely analyzed as structural components. They are treated as biographical details, background elements in a celebrity narrative that is understood to be driven by talent, timing, and public relations strategy. This is a failure of analytical precision. Romantic partnerships, particularly for public figures, function as identity formalizing mechanisms. They are the social instruments through which ambiguous or emergent identity claims are crystallized, validated, and made legible to mass audiences. Travis Kelce's relationship with Kayla Nicole, a black woman with a significant media presence and a personal brand centered on lifestyle, fashion, and cultural commentary, was not a romantic footnote in his career. It was the structural event that transformed his ambient cultural fluency into a formalized, publicly legible identity. Without Kayla Nicole, Kelce's cross-cultural appeal would have remained latent, a set of stylistic tendencies and communicative habits that audiences might have noticed but could not have categorized. With Kayla Nicole, the latent became manifest, the ambient became explicit, the marketing technology was activated. To understand how romantic partnerships formalize identity, consider the broader social dynamics at work. In American culture, romantic partnerships are understood as statements of identity. The person you choose to be with is read by the public as a declaration of who you are, what you value, and which social world you inhabit. This reading is automatic, unconscious, and extremely powerful. When a white male public figure is seen with a white female partner, the public registers this as confirmation of expected social norms. No additional identity information is generated. The partnership resolves immediately in the viewer's mind and produces no cognitive surplus. When a white male public figure is seen with a black female partner, however, the public engages in a more intensive identity computation. The partnership does not resolve immediately. It generates questions. It disrupts expectations. It demands that the viewer construct a more complex model of who this person is, what social worlds he moves in, and what cultural values he holds. This cognitive surplus is the raw material of brand differentiation. It is the mechanism through which a partnership that violates demographic expectations generates outsized attention, engagement, and memorability. Kayla Nicole brought to this partnership a set of assets that amplified its identity formalizing power. She was not merely a romantic partner, she was a brand in her own right. Her social media presence, which encompassed platforms including Instagram and YouTube, was built around a carefully curated aesthetic that centered black female beauty, fashion, and lifestyle aspiration. Her audience was predominantly black women, women who followed her not merely for entertainment, but as an aspirational reference point, a model of how to present oneself, how to dress, how to navigate the social landscape of young black womanhood in America. When Kelce entered a relationship with Kayla Nicole, he did not merely acquire a girlfriend. He acquired access to her audience, her aesthetic ecosystem, and her identity-validating function. Her presence beside him was, for her audience, a form of endorsement. If Kayla Nicole, a woman whose entire brand was built on cultural literacy and aesthetic discernment, chose this man, then this man must possess the cultural qualities that her brand represented. The logic is circular but devastatingly effective. The partner validates the brand, and the brand validates the partner. This mechanism has direct parallels in other domains of public life. Consider the identity formalizing function of Michelle Obama in Barack Obama's political career. Before their partnership became publicly visible, Barack Obama's identity was multiply ambiguous. He was biracial, raised in Hawaii and Indonesia, educated at Columbia and Harvard, a community organizer on the south side of Chicago. Each of these biographical elements pointed in a different cultural direction. His identity did not resolve into a single, easily categorizable narrative. Michelle Robinson Obama, a black woman from the south side of Chicago with deep roots in the black American experience, served as the identity formalizing mechanism that resolved this ambiguity. Her presence beside him communicated to black audiences that he was of them, that his cultural orientation was rooted in the black American experience despite the multinational complexity of his biography. The partnership did not change who Barack Obama was. It changed how the public was able to read who he was. It provided a key that unlocked a specific identity interpretation and made it dominant. Kelce's partnership with Kayla Nicole operated through an analogous mechanism at a different scale and in a different domain. His cultural fluency, his sartorial signal system, his communicative style, all of these elements had been building for years through the formation processes described in previous sections. But they existed as unformalized potential, as a set of signals that were being transmitted but had not yet been anchored to a coherent identity narrative. Kayla Nicole provided the anchor. Her presence beside him formalized the narrative. It said, in a language that required no words, this man is culturally fluent in black social spaces. This man is chosen by a black woman whose entire brand is predicated on cultural discernment. This man belongs in spaces that white men typically do not occupy. The formalization was immediate and permanent. From the moment their relationship became public, Kelce's cross-cultural identity was no longer a matter of interpretation. It was a matter of record. The audience dynamics of this formalization deserve careful examination. For black female audiences, the Kelce-Kayla-Nicole partnership generated a specific and powerful narrative. The narrative of the culturally literate white man who has earned, through demonstrated fluency and respect, the romantic attention of a black woman. This narrative is extraordinarily rare in American media. The overwhelming majority of interracial celebrity relationships, in which the male partner is white and the female partner is black, receive either no public attention or negative public attention. They are treated as anomalies, as departures from expected social patterns, and they are frequently subjected to scrutiny that same-race partnerships are not. But the Kelce-Kayla-Nicole partnership, because it was supported by the entire infrastructure of Kelce's cultural formation, because his fluency was authentic rather than performed, because his sartorial choices and communicative style had already primed black female audiences to see him as culturally literate, was received not as an anomaly, but as a confirmation. It confirmed what the sartorial signal system had already been broadcasting. This man understands us, respects us, and belongs in our cultural space. The partnership did not create the narrative, it confirmed it. And confirmation, in the psychology of brand perception, is far more powerful than creation because it leverages the audience's existing beliefs rather than attempting to implant new ones. For white audiences, the partnership generated a different but equally valuable narrative, the narrative of the boundary-crossing individual, the man who is not confined by the social conventions of his demographic background, who moves through the world with a freedom and fluidity that most people can only admire from a distance. This narrative is aspirational. It communicates a form of social mastery that transcends athletic achievement. The man who can cross cultural boundaries with authenticity and ease possesses a form of social intelligence that the market values enormously, because social intelligence is the scarcest and most consequential form of intelligence in a media environment that is increasingly defined by cross-cultural interaction. The economic consequences of this identity formalization were substantial and measurable. Kelce's marketability, already elevated by his on-field performance and his emerging cultural visibility, accelerated dramatically during and after his relationship with Kayla Nicole. His social media following expanded beyond the core football audience to encompass lifestyle, fashion, and cultural commentary audiences. His brand partnerships diversified beyond the standard athlete endorsement categories of sports apparel and fast food to include fashion, grooming, and lifestyle brands that target culturally literate consumers. His media appearances expanded beyond sports media to include entertainment, lifestyle, and cultural programming. Each of these expansions can be traced directly to the identity formalization that the Kayla Nicole partnership provided. The partnership made his cross-cultural appeal legible to brand partners and media gatekeepers who might otherwise have categorized him as a standard white male athlete. It gave them permission to see him as something more, something that justified the premium pricing and expanded platform that his marketing architecture deserved. It is also necessary to examine what the partnership cost, or more precisely, what it revealed about the costs of identity formalization through relational proximity. When the Kelce-Kayla-Nicole relationship ended, some commentators attributed the breakup to financial dynamics, specifically allegations that Kelce expected Nicole to share expenses during the relationship, despite his significantly higher income. Whether these allegations are accurate is less important than what the public discourse around them revealed. It revealed that the public had come to understand the partnership not merely as a romance, but as a brand relationship, a co-branding arrangement in which both parties contributed assets and expected returns. The language of the discourse, the references to investment, to contribution, to what each party brought to the table, was the language of business partnership applied to intimate relationship. This is not cynicism, it is structural awareness. The public, without being explicitly told, had intuited the identity formalizing function of the partnership and was evaluating its dissolution in the same terms. The dissolution of the Kayla-Nicole relationship also revealed the durability of the identity formalization it had produced. Even after the relationship ended, Kelce's cross-cultural identity remained intact. The formalization once achieved did not require the ongoing presence of the formalizing mechanism. The narrative had been established, the audience associations had been encoded, and the brand equity had been accumulated. Kelce could move forward into his next romantic partnership, the one that would prove to be the most consequential of all, with a cross-cultural identity that was already fully formed and publicly validated. This durability is a critical property of identity formalization through relational proximity. It is not a lease. It is a permanent alteration of the public's model of who the individual is. Once the formalization is achieved, it becomes part of the individual's permanent brand architecture, surviving the dissolution of the specific relationship that produced it. There is an additional dimension to the Kayla-Nicole partnership that deserves attention in the context of this case study's broader argument. Kayla-Nicole's audience of black women did not merely receive Kelce as a cultural curiosity. Many of them adopted him as a figure of aspirational significance within their own cultural framework. The phenomenon of a white man who is culturally fluent, physically imposing, professionally successful, and romantically committed to a black woman activated a specific set of cultural narratives within the black female audience. It activated the narrative of recognition, the idea that black female beauty and cultural standards are being acknowledged and valued by individuals outside the black community. It activated the narrative of crossover, the idea that cultural fluency can transcend racial boundaries. And it activated the narrative of validation, the idea that the aesthetic and cultural standards of black womanhood are not parochial or niche, but universal and aspirational. Each of these narratives contributed to a deepening of Kelce's brand equity within the black female demographic, an equity that would prove invaluable when he transitioned into the relationship that would make him one of the most visible men on the planet. The mechanism of identity formalization through relational proximity is, this case study argues, one of the most under-theorized phenomena in marketing science. It operates across multiple domains, from politics to entertainment to professional sports. It functions by leveraging the public's automatic tendency to read romantic partnerships as identity declarations. It generates brand differentiation through cognitive non-resolution. It formalizes latent identity claims that might otherwise remain ambiguous or invisible. And it produces durable alterations to the public's model of the individual that survive the dissolution of the specific relationship that triggered them. In Kelce's case, the Kayla-Nicole partnership was the activation event that transformed a culturally fluent athlete into a culturally formalized brand, a brand whose cross-cultural legibility would make it uniquely suited to the most extraordinary partnership opportunity in modern American celebrity culture. The cultural critic might object that this analysis reduces a human relationship to a marketing function. This objection misunderstands the argument. The claim is not that Kelce entered a relationship with Kayla-Nicole for strategic purposes. The claim is that the structural effects of the relationship on his public identity are analyzable in marketing terms, regardless of the personal motivations that produce the relationship. People do not choose their partners for marketing reasons, but the partners they choose inevitably affect their marketing position. The task of the case study is not to impute motive, but to trace effects. And the effects of the Kelce-Kayla-Nicole partnership on his brand architecture are too significant and too structurally consequential to be dismissed as biographical coincidence. The relationship formalized what Cleveland Heights, the tight end pipeline, and the NFL locker room had built. It made the invisible visible. It made the ambient explicit. And in doing so, it prepared the ground for what was to come. The specific mechanics of how Kayla-Nicole's audience was transferred to Kelce's brand deserve additional examination, because the transfer mechanism reveals principles that are applicable far beyond this individual case. Audience transfer in the context of celebrity partnerships does not operate like audience transfer in traditional media or advertising. When a brand purchases advertising on a television program, it is renting access to the program's audience for the duration of the advertisement. The access is temporary, transactional, and explicitly commercial. When a celebrity partnership forms, the audience transfer is organic, continuous, and implicitly endorsed. Kayla-Nicole's followers did not see a paid advertisement for Travis Kelce. They saw the man their aspirational figure had chosen. The endorsement was embedded in the relationship itself, which made it far more persuasive than any commercial communication could be, because the audience understood that Kayla-Nicole's choice of partner was a genuine expression of her values and preferences, rather than a compensated promotional activity. The architecture of social media amplified this transfer mechanism. On Instagram, where visual presentation is the primary currency and where relationship content consistently generates the highest engagement rates, the Kelce-Nicole partnership produced content that was consumed by both partners' audiences simultaneously. A photograph of the couple at an event was shared by both accounts, liked and commented on by followers of both accounts, and algorithmically distributed to the discovery feeds of users who followed neither account, but whose engagement patterns suggested an interest in fashion, lifestyle, or celebrity content. Each piece of partnership content functioned as a cross-pollination event, introducing Kelce to audiences who would never have encountered him through sports media channels and introducing Nicole to audiences who would never have encountered her through lifestyle media channels. The compound effect of hundreds of such cross-pollination events over the course of a multi-year relationship was a permanent expansion of both partners' audience footprints, an expansion that persisted even after the relationship ended because the audience members who were acquired through cross-pollination had, by that point, developed independent reasons to follow each partner's content. The concept of aspirational proximity is also relevant here. In consumer psychology, aspirational proximity refers to the perceived closeness between a consumer and an aspirational figure. Consumers are more engaged with aspirational figures who feel achievably close rather than impossibly distant. Kayla Nicole, by virtue of her position as an influencer rather than a traditional celebrity, occupied a zone of aspirational proximity that made her audience particularly receptive to information about her personal life. She was famous enough to be aspirational, but accessible enough to feel like someone her followers could imagine knowing personally. This accessibility extended to her romantic partner. Kelce, experienced through the lens of Kayla Nicole's content, was not a distant football celebrity. He was the boyfriend of someone the audience felt they knew, which placed him within a zone of parasocial intimacy that would have been inaccessible through any other channel. This parasocial intimacy created an emotional investment in Kelce that transcended his identity as a football player, and that laid the groundwork for the far more intense parasocial investment that would develop when he entered Taylor Swift's orbit. Finally, the Kayla Nicole partnership established a template for how Kelce would navigate the highly public romantic partnerships that define celebrity life. It taught him, through lived experience rather than media coaching, how to be a visible partner without overshadowing his partner's brand. It taught him how to participate in social media content without appearing calculated or performative. It taught him how to absorb the scrutiny that accompanies a public relationship without generating negative attention. These are skills that cannot be learned in a media training session. They can only be acquired through the experience of navigating a public relationship with a partner whose own brand is sophisticated enough to require careful co-navigation. Kayla Nicole was, in this sense, not only an identity formalizing mechanism, she was a training environment, a space in which Kelce developed the relational media competence that would prove essential when he entered the most scrutinized celebrity relationship in the world. In financial markets, an information asymmetry exists when one party to a transaction possesses material information that the other party does not. The party with superior information can exploit this advantage to extract value from the market that would not be available if information were symmetrically distributed. This principle, which earned George Akerlof, Michael Spence, and Joseph Stiglitz the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2001, is typically applied to transactions involving goods, services, and financial instruments. But the principle applies with equal force, and perhaps greater consequence, to transactions in the cultural marketplace. Travis Kelce, through the formation processes described in the preceding sections, accumulated a form of cultural information that was not available to the overwhelming majority of his competitors in the NFL marketplace. He possessed, by virtue of his Cleveland Heights upbringing, his tight end pipeline formation, his 12 years of NFL cultural immersion, his sartorial signal system, and his identity formalization through Kayla Nicole, a body of cultural knowledge that allowed him to generate value in market segments that other NFL players could not access. This knowledge constituted an information asymmetry, and his deployment of it constitutes one of the most effective examples of information asymmetric brand building in modern professional sports. To understand the nature of this asymmetry, consider the typical information environment of an NFL tight end. The average NFL tight end, regardless of his talent level, possesses information that allows him to generate value in a limited set of market segments: the core football audience, which values on-field performance, the local fan base of his team, which values geographic and organizational loyalty, and the narrow endorsement categories that are traditionally available to non-quarterback NFL players, primarily sports apparel, fast food, automotive, and beer brands. These market segments are well understood by sports marketing professionals. They are efficiently priced, meaning that the value available in each segment is fully exploited by the existing supply of athlete endorsers. The tight end who enters these segments competes directly with wide receivers, linebackers, defensive ends, and other position players who are all vying for the same brand partnerships, the same media appearances, and the same fan engagement. The competition is intense, the margins are thin, and the differentiation opportunities are minimal. Kelce possessed all of the information necessary to compete in these standard market segments, but he also possessed an additional body of information, the cultural codes, aesthetic sensibilities, and cross-demographic communicative abilities described in previous sections that allowed him to access market segments that were invisible to his competitors. He could access the black female lifestyle market, a demographic segment with enormous spending power and cultural influence that is almost entirely untapped by white male athletes. He could access the cross-cultural fashion market, where his sartorial signal system generated brand partnerships that would never have been offered to a standard profile tight end. He could access the entertainment and media market, where his communicative fluency across cultural registers made him a viable candidate for hosting, appearing on, and producing content that extended well beyond the sports media ecosystem. And he could access the aspirational lifestyle market, where his cross-cultural identity positioned him as a figure of fascination for audiences who would never watch an NFL game but who were captivated by the incongruity of his presentation. Each of these additional market segments represents value that was invisible to Kelce's competitors because they did not possess the cultural information necessary to access it. This is the precise definition of an information asymmetry. The market was there, the value was there, but only the party with superior information could extract it. And the information that created the asymmetry was not proprietary data or insider knowledge in the traditional sense. It was cultural fluency, the accumulated residue of a specific formation history that could not be replicated by any competitor who had not undergone the same formation process. This is what makes cultural information asymmetries so powerful and so durable. Unlike financial information asymmetries, which can be eliminated through regulation, disclosure requirements, or technological advances, cultural information asymmetries are rooted in the lived experience of individuals and cannot be transferred, taught, or reverse engineered. You cannot hire a consultant to teach you the cultural fluency that Kelce possesses. You cannot attend a seminar or complete a certification program. The information is embodied. It is tacit. It was acquired through decades of immersive experience, and it can only be deployed by the individual who acquired it. The financial returns on this information asymmetry are substantial and accelerating. Kelce's endorsement portfolio has expanded to include brands across virtually every consumer category: Nike, Old Spice, State Farm, Pfizer, Bud Light, McDonald's, Dick's Sporting Goods, DirecTV, Walgreens, and many others. The breadth of this portfolio is itself evidence of the information asymmetry at work. No other tight end in NFL history has endorsed brands across this many categories because no other tight end has possessed the cross-cultural legibility necessary to represent such a diverse array of brands credibly. Each of these brands selected Kelce not merely because he is a great football player, although he is, but because he can communicate credibly to audience segments that other football players cannot reach. He is the rare athlete who can appear in a Pfizer health awareness campaign, and a Bud Light party commercial, and a Nike athletic performance spot, and an Old Spice grooming advertisement without any of these appearances seeming incongruent. The reason is that his cultural operating system, built through the formation processes described in this case study, contains the codes necessary to operate credibly across all of these brand contexts. He is not stretching his brand to fit disparate endorsement categories. The categories fit him because his brand was built at the intersection of the cultural worlds those categories represent. The podcast economy provides another illustration of the information asymmetry at work. The New Heights podcast, which Kelce co-hosts with his brother Jason, became the #1 sports podcast in the United States and the #1 sports podcast globally on Spotify. It reached the #2 position among all podcasts on Apple's platform. These numbers are extraordinary for a sports podcast, and they are directly attributable to the cross-cultural audience that Kelce's information asymmetry allows him to access. The podcast's audience is not composed exclusively of football fans. It includes lifestyle consumers, cultural commentators, entertainment audiences, and the cross-demographic following that Kelce's identity formalization through Kayla Nicole and subsequent relationship with Taylor Swift generated. The podcast is, in effect, a monetization instrument for the cultural capital that Kelce accumulated through his formation process. It converts attention into advertising revenue, brand partnerships, and media equity at a rate that reflects the breadth of the audience his information asymmetry allows him to reach. The Kelce Jam Music Festival, launched in April 2023, represents yet another conversion pathway for the information asymmetry. The festival, held during NFL Draft Weekend, sold its first 10,000 tickets in 20 minutes and eventually sold out at 18,000 attendees. The second edition in 2024 drew 20,000 fans, with headlining performances from 2 Chainz, Diplo, and Lil Wayne. The lineup selection is itself a semiotic statement. 2 Chainz and Lil Wayne are artists whose primary audiences are black. Diplo is an artist whose primary audience is cross-cultural. The festival, by curating this lineup, signals that Kelce's cultural world spans the demographic categories that these artists represent. It is not a country music festival, which would signal a conventionally white cultural orientation. It is not a rock festival, which would signal a conventionally white male cultural orientation. It is a festival that reflects the cross-cultural operating system of its creator, and the audience it attracts reflects the cross-demographic appeal that this operating system generates. The economic concept of rent-seeking is also relevant here. In economics, rent-seeking refers to the practice of extracting value from existing wealth rather than creating new wealth. Kelce's information asymmetry allows him to extract rent from cultural capital that already exists in the communities whose codes he has learned to deploy. The black female lifestyle market already exists. The cross-cultural fashion market already exists. The entertainment media market already exists. Kelce did not create these markets. He learned to access them by deploying cultural information that his competitors do not possess. The rent he extracts, in the form of endorsement income, media revenue, and brand equity, is the return on the cultural capital he accumulated through his formation process. This is not exploitation. It is the natural functioning of a market in which information asymmetries create opportunities for those who possess them. The cultural communities whose codes Kelce deploys are not diminished by his deployment. If anything, they are elevated because his deployment extends the reach and visibility of their cultural contributions to audiences that might otherwise never encounter them. There is also the question of how the information asymmetry affects Kelce's value to the Kansas City Chiefs organization. Professional sports teams derive revenue from multiple streams: ticket sales, merchandise, media rights, sponsorships, and the general economic activity generated by the team's presence in the market. A player's contribution to these revenue streams is typically evaluated in terms of on-field performance. A player who generates more wins generates more ticket sales, more media interest, and more sponsorship value. But Kelce's contribution to the Chiefs' revenue streams extends beyond his on-field production, because his information asymmetry generates attention and engagement from audience segments that do not typically engage with the NFL. His cross-cultural following drives social media engagement, merchandise sales, and media attention at levels that exceed what his on-field statistics alone would predict. The Chiefs organization, whether or not it articulates the dynamic in these terms, benefits from the surplus value that Kelce's information asymmetry generates. This surplus value creates a feedback loop that further amplifies the asymmetry. Because Kelce generates surplus revenue for the organization has an incentive to keep him on the roster and to feature him prominently in marketing and media activities, even if his on-field production begins to decline with age. The information asymmetry, in other words, creates organizational dependency. The team needs Kelce not only for what he does on the field, but for what he does off it, for the cultural capital he generates and the audience segments he reaches. This dependency gives Kelce leverage in contract negotiations and roster decisions that other tight ends do not possess. His most recent contract, a 3-year deal worth approximately $54.74 million, reflects not only his on-field value, but the surplus value generated by his cultural capital. He is being compensated not as a tight end, but as a marketing technology, a human instrument whose value to the organization extends across every revenue stream the organization operates. The information asymmetry also operates at the level of social capital. In sociological terms, social capital refers to the networks, relationships, and social resources that an individual can draw upon to achieve economic and social outcomes. Kelce's cultural fluency provides him with social capital that spans multiple demographic communities. He has relationships and credibility in black cultural spaces, in white mainstream spaces, in sports media, in entertainment media, in fashion, and in lifestyle. Each of these networks generates opportunities, referrals, introductions, and collaborations that are unavailable to individuals whose social capital is confined to a single demographic or cultural community. The compound effect of social capital across multiple communities is not additive. It is multiplicative. Each additional community in which Kelce possesses credibility amplifies the value of his connections in every other community, because the ability to bridge communities is itself the most valuable form of social capital in a media economy that is increasingly defined by cross-cultural interaction. The final dimension of the information asymmetry that must be addressed is its relationship to authenticity. In the consumer marketplace, authenticity is the most valuable and most difficult to manufacture brand attribute. Consumers can detect inauthenticity with remarkable precision, and they punish it severely. Brands that are perceived as performing cultural affiliation rather than genuinely possessing it face consumer backlash, social media criticism, and ultimately brand degradation. Kelce's information asymmetry is immune to this risk because it is not performed. It is the genuine output of a genuine formation process. His cultural fluency was not learned from a consultant. His sartorial choices were not prescribed by a stylist. His communicative style was not coached by a media trainer. All of these attributes emerged organically from the structural conditions of his upbringing, his positional development, and his professional immersion. The authenticity of the information asymmetry is what makes it so durable, so resistant to competitive replication, and so valuable as a long-term brand asset. It is not a strategy, it is a structure. And structures, unlike strategies, do not degrade with time or exposure. They compound. The compounding nature of Kelce's information asymmetry deserves further quantitative framing. In financial investment theory, compound returns are distinguished from simple returns by the reinvestment of gains. Each period's returns become the base for subsequent periods' returns, producing exponential rather than linear growth. Kelce's cultural capital operates through an analogous compounding mechanism. Each brand partnership, each media appearance, each public event generates not only immediate returns in the form of revenue and attention, but also secondary returns in the form of expanded network connections, enhanced credibility with new audience segments, and increased bargaining power in subsequent negotiations. The endorsement deal with Nike enhances his credibility with fashion audiences, which makes him more attractive to lifestyle brands, which enhances his credibility with entertainment audiences, which makes him more attractive to media companies, which enhances his visibility, which makes him more attractive to Nike. The loop is self-reinforcing, and its rate of return accelerates with each cycle. This compounding effect explains why Kelce's off-field earnings have grown at a rate that far exceeds the growth rate of his on-field compensation. On-field compensation in the NFL is subject to salary cap constraints, market valuations based on positional production, and age-related depreciation. Off-field earnings face no such constraints. They are bounded only by the total addressable market that the individual can access, and Kelce's information asymmetry continuously expands his total addressable market by opening new audience segments and brand categories. The result is a divergence between on-field and off-field earnings trajectories that is unprecedented for a tight end, and that reflects the unique economic dynamics of the information asymmetry. The broader lesson for marketing theory is that information asymmetries in the cultural marketplace operate differently from information asymmetries in financial markets. In financial markets, information asymmetries tend to be transient. Once the asymmetric information is disclosed or discovered by other market participants, the advantage is eliminated. In cultural markets, information asymmetries are permanent, or at least as permanent as the lifetime of the individual who possesses them. Kelce's cultural fluency cannot be disclosed in a way that would allow competitors to replicate it. It cannot be leaked, published, or reverse engineered. It is embedded in his body, his habits, his reflexes, and his social networks in ways that are inseparable from the individual who carries them. This permanence is what makes cultural information asymmetries so extraordinarily valuable. They are the only form of competitive advantage in the marketplace that is truly, permanently non-replicable. The social media economy provides a particularly clear illustration of how the information asymmetry converts to financial returns. On platforms like Instagram and TikTok, content featuring Kelce generates engagement rates that exceed what his follower count alone would predict. This engagement surplus is a direct measure of the information asymmetry at work. Audiences who follow Kelce for football are exposed to content that reflects his cross-cultural operating system. Audiences who follow him for fashion are exposed to content that reflects his athletic identity. Audiences who follow him for his relationship with Taylor Swift are exposed to content that reflects his cultural versatility and emotional expressiveness. Each audience segment encounters content that exceeds their initial expectations, and this exceeded expectation is the engagement surplus that the information asymmetry generates. In the attention economy, engagement surplus is the most valuable commodity. It is the measure of how much additional attention an individual commands beyond what their category membership would predict. Kelce commands more attention than a tight end should, more attention than a white male athlete should, more attention than a non-musician boyfriend of a pop star should. Each of these surplus quantities is a direct conversion of cultural information asymmetry into measurable economic value. The relationship between Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift is understood by most observers as a celebrity romance, a story of two famous people who met, were attracted to each other, and began dating. This is the narrative surface. Beneath it lies a structural reality so complex and so tightly constrained that the partnership, when analyzed through the lens of optimization theory, reveals itself to be one of the most improbable convergences in modern American public life. Taylor Swift is not merely a famous woman, she is an institution. Her career spans more than 2 decades. Her cultural footprint extends across music, film, fashion, philanthropy, and politics. Her fan base, known as Swifties, numbers in the hundreds of millions globally and constitutes one of the most active, devoted, and economically significant fan communities in the history of entertainment. Her tours generate billions of dollars in revenue. Her albums reshape the commercial landscape of the music industry upon their release. Her public statements move markets, influence elections, and dominate news cycles. She is, by any reasonable measure, one of the 5 most culturally powerful individuals on the planet. And the question of who such an individual partners with is not a personal question. It is an optimization problem of extraordinary complexity. An optimization problem, in mathematical terms, is a problem in which one seeks to find the best solution from a set of feasible solutions, given a set of constraints. The constraints in the Taylor Swift partnership optimization are numerous, overlapping, and in many cases, mutually contradictory. They operate across multiple dimensions simultaneously, and their interaction produces a solution space so narrow that the number of individuals who satisfy all constraints simultaneously is vanishingly small. This section enumerates the constraints, demonstrates how Kelce satisfies them, and argues that the satisfaction of these constraints is not coincidental, but is the structural product of the formation processes described in the preceding 7 sections of this case study. Constraint 1, physical compatibility. Taylor Swift is approximately 5 feet 11 inches tall. In public appearances, she frequently wears heels that place her effective height at 6 feet 1 to 6 feet 3 inches. The aesthetic conventions of American media, which structure the visual expectations of Swift's audience, require that a male romantic partner be visibly taller than the female partner in public appearances. This is not a personal preference. It is a structural requirement imposed by the visual grammar of celebrity photography, red carpet events, and media coverage. A male partner who is shorter than or the same height as Swift in heels would generate visual incongruity in every public appearance, producing a persistent low-grade narrative of physical mismatch that would subtly undermine the aspirational quality of the partnership. This constraint eliminates the vast majority of American men from consideration. The male partner must be at least 6 feet 3 inches tall to reliably maintain the height differential in all visual contexts, and preferably taller. Kelce, at 6 feet 5 inches, satisfies this constraint with margin. He is visibly taller than Swift in every configuration, including when she wears her tallest heels. The physical compatibility is immediate and visually unambiguous. Constraint 2, fame parity. Taylor Swift's level of fame imposes a paradoxical constraint on partnership selection. The partner cannot be significantly more famous than she is because that would displace her from the center of her own narrative. The partner cannot be significantly less famous than she is because that would generate a power imbalance that would be read by the public as either pity or condescension. The partner must be famous enough to be recognizable as a significant figure in his own right, but not so famous that he competes with Swift for narrative centrality. This constraint eliminates most entertainers, who are either too famous or too obscure. It eliminates most politicians, who carry partisan baggage that would complicate Swift's carefully managed public image. It eliminates most business leaders who lack the public visibility necessary to register as credible partners for someone of Swift's profile. Professional athletes occupy a unique position in the fame hierarchy that makes them particularly suitable. They are publicly recognizable without being culturally dominant. They possess a form of fame that is legible to mass audiences, but is not competitive with the fame of a global pop star. And among professional athletes, Kelce occupies an optimal position, famous enough to be recognized beyond the sports world, thanks to his cultural visibility and information asymmetry, but not so famous that he threatens to overshadow Swift's narrative centrality. Constraint 3, cultural versatility. Taylor Swift's audience is among the most demographically diverse in popular music. Her fan base includes white women, who constitute the historical core of her following, increasingly significant numbers of black women who were drawn into her orbit during the Eras tour and through her genre expansions, men of various backgrounds who consume her music and media presence, and international audiences across Europe, Asia, Latin America, and beyond. A romantic partner who is culturally legible only to the white American mainstream would limit the aspirational value of the partnership for non-white audience segments. A partner who is culturally fluent across racial and demographic lines extends the aspirational reach of the partnership to audiences that a monoculturally positioned partner could not access. Kelce's cross-cultural operating system, built through the formation processes described in this case study, makes him uniquely suited to satisfy this constraint. His cultural fluency in black social spaces, formalized through his relationship with Kayla Nicole and continuously reinforced by his NFL immersion, means that his presence beside Swift does not alienate non-white audiences. If anything, it signals to those audiences that the Swift brand is permeable, that it is not exclusively a white cultural institution, but one that is capable of incorporating individuals who move fluidly across cultural boundaries. Constraint 4, media competence. Taylor Swift's public life is conducted under a level of media scrutiny that is arguably unmatched by any other living public figure. Her romantic partner must be capable of navigating this scrutiny without generating negative media attention. He must be comfortable on camera. He must be articulate in interviews. He must be capable of the specific form of performative naturalness that media environments demand, the ability to appear spontaneous and authentic while operating within the constraints of a heavily managed public image. This constraint eliminates individuals who are media shy, who are prone to controversial public statements, or who lack the communicative fluency to operate credibly in entertainment media contexts. Kelce, whose communicative abilities were built through his Cleveland Heights formation and refined through his NFL media experience, his podcast, and his hosting appearances, including Saturday Night Live, satisfies this constraint with ease. He is one of the most media-competent athletes in professional sports, capable of operating in formats ranging from press conferences to comedy sketches to long-form interview conversations without generating the kind of awkwardness or controversy that would compromise Swift's brand. Constraint 5, narrative resolution. This is perhaps the most structurally complex constraint and the one that Kelce satisfies most completely. Taylor Swift's career narrative is built on a series of romantic relationships that have been publicly documented, analyzed, and memorialized in her songwriting. From her earliest hits about teenage heartbreak through her stadium-era anthems of romantic disillusionment, Swift's artistic identity has been constructed around the emotional arc of love, loss, and longing. Her fan base, the Swifties who have grown up with her over 2 decades, have internalized this arc as a shared emotional journey. They have experienced her heartbreaks as their own, they have celebrated her triumphs as their own, and they have been waiting, with an intensity that only a decades-long parasocial relationship can produce, for the narrative to resolve. They want the happy ending. They want the partner who is worthy of the woman they have watched grow from a teenage country singer into a global cultural force. This desire for narrative resolution imposes an extraordinarily demanding constraint on the partner. He must be perceived not merely as a suitable match, but as the resolution of a generational story, the culmination of 2 decades of public romantic searching. He must be tall enough, famous enough, charming enough, culturally versatile enough, and emotionally accessible enough to satisfy the collective desire of hundreds of millions of fans who have been waiting for this moment for the better part of their adult lives. Constraint 6, political neutrality. Taylor Swift operates in a political environment of extreme sensitivity. She has been claimed by both liberal and conservative cultural constituencies at various points in her career. Her endorsements carry enormous political weight. A romantic partner with strong, publicly stated political affiliations would generate partisan conflict that could alienate significant portions of her audience. The partner must be capable of existing in the public eye without becoming a lightning rod for political controversy. Kelce has demonstrated this capacity. While he was among the highest-profile white NFL players to kneel during the national anthem in 2017, his overall public persona is not defined by political activism. He is perceived as a fun, gregarious, culturally open individual rather than a political figure. This perception allows him to exist beside Swift without generating the partisan backlash that a more overtly political partner might provoke. Constraint 7, emotional accessibility. Swift's brand is built on emotional vulnerability. Her music invites listeners into her inner emotional life in ways that few other artists have achieved. A romantic partner who is emotionally closed, who is perceived as cold or inaccessible, would create a narrative dissonance with the emotional openness that defines Swift's artistic identity. The partner must be perceived as emotionally available, expressive, and capable of the kind of public displays of affection that reinforce Swift's brand of authentic emotional engagement. Kelce's personality, which has been consistently described by coaches, teammates, family members, and media as exuberant, warm, and emotionally expressive, satisfies this constraint perfectly. His energy, his enthusiasm, his willingness to celebrate publicly and to express emotion without reservation, all of these qualities align with the emotional register of Swift's brand in ways that reinforce rather than contradict her artistic identity. When these 7 constraints are applied simultaneously, the solution space, the set of individuals who satisfy all constraints at once, contracts to a vanishingly small number. The individual must be at least 6'3", but preferably taller. He must be famous, but not too famous. He must be culturally versatile across racial and demographic lines. He must be media competent at the highest level. He must be perceived as the narrative resolution of a decades-long public love story. He must be politically neutral. And he must be emotionally accessible and expressive. The probability that any randomly selected American male satisfies all 7 constraints simultaneously is, by any reasonable estimate, infinitesimally small. The probability that an NFL tight end from Cleveland Heights, Ohio, who was formed through the specific sequence of cultural, athletic, and social experiences described in this case study, satisfies all 7 constraints simultaneously is also small but is significantly higher than the baseline because each stage of Kelce's formation process optimized him along one or more of the constraint dimensions without his conscious awareness or intention. This is the central insight of the Taylor Swift optimization problem. Kelce did not set out to become the ideal partner for one of the most famous women in the world. He did not engineer his cultural fluency, his media competence, his emotional accessibility, or his physical profile for the purpose of attracting Taylor Swift. Each of these attributes developed through processes that were entirely unrelated to Swift and that preceded any contact between them. But the confluence of these attributes, the way they intersect and compound and satisfy a set of constraints that no other individual satisfies as completely, produces an outcome that appears designed, even though it is emergent. The marketing technology that is Travis Kelce was not built for Taylor Swift. It was built by Cleveland Heights, by the tight end pipeline, by the NFL locker room, by the sartorial signal system, and by the Kayla Nicole identity formalization. But once built, it happened to satisfy the exact specifications that the Taylor Swift optimization problem demanded. The technology found its market, the solution met its problem, and the result has been one of the most culturally consequential celebrity partnerships of the 21st century. The optimization framework also illuminates why the partnership has been so commercially successful for both parties. When a solution satisfies all constraints in an optimization problem, the system operates at peak efficiency. There is no wasted energy, no narrative friction, no visual incongruity, no political liability, no emotional dissonance. Every public appearance reinforces the brand narratives of both partners simultaneously. Every media cycle generates value for both brands without depleting either. The partnership is not a zero-sum competition for attention. It is a positive-sum amplification system in which each partner's brand equity compounds the others. Swift becomes more relatable through her association with an athlete whose authenticity and emotional expressiveness humanize her at a scale that might otherwise feel inaccessible. Kelce becomes more visible through his association with a global pop star whose audience extends his reach into demographic and geographic markets that no NFL player has ever accessed. The optimization is mutual, which is what makes it sustainable, and its sustainability is what makes it so valuable as a case study in the structural determinants of elite partnership formation. The optimization framework also generates a prediction about the rarity of what Kelce represents in the broader landscape of potential Swift partners. If one were to model the probability of an individual satisfying all 7 constraints simultaneously, even with generous assumptions about the size of each constraint's feasible set, the resulting probability would be vanishingly small. Assume that the height constraint eliminates 90% of adult American men. Assume that the fame parity constraint eliminates 99% of the remainder. Assume that the cultural versatility constraint eliminates 90% of the remainder. Assume that the media competence constraint eliminates 80% of the remainder. Assume that the narrative resolution constraint eliminates 95% of the remainder. Assume that the political neutrality constraint eliminates 50% of the remainder. And assume that the emotional accessibility constraint eliminates 60% of the remainder. The compound probability of satisfying all 7 constraints simultaneously is approximately 0.0002% of the adult male population of the United States, which translates to roughly 250 individuals out of 130 million adult men. And of those 250, the overwhelming majority would be disqualified by practical considerations: married, geographically inaccessible, occupationally incompatible, or otherwise unavailable. The actual number of feasible solutions to the Taylor Swift optimization problem is, by any reasonable estimate, in the single digits. This extreme rarity has implications for how the partnership should be understood. It is not the product of luck, although chance played a role in the initial connection. It is the product of convergence, the meeting of a problem and its solution in a marketplace where both the problem and the solution are extraordinarily rare. The problem, the set of constraints imposed by Swift's institutional position, was always there. It was embedded in the structure of her career from the moment she became a public figure. The solution, the specific configuration of attributes that Kelce possesses, was also always there. It was embedded in the structural conditions of his formation from the moment he was born in Cleveland Heights to a family of modest means in a diverse community. Neither the problem nor the solution was designed. Both emerged from the structural forces of their respective domains. And the convergence, when it occurred, produced an outcome that appears miraculous in its improbability, but is entirely explicable in structural terms. The concept of constraint satisfaction also illuminates the strategic value of the partnership from Swift's organizational perspective. Swift's career is managed by a sophisticated team of professionals who understand, at a granular level, the economic and cultural dynamics of her brand. This team would have been aware, long before Kelce appeared, of the narrative demand for a romantic resolution. They would have understood that the right partner could amplify every dimension of the brand simultaneously: concert attendance, album sales, merchandise revenue, media coverage, social media engagement, and cultural relevance. The arrival of an individual who satisfies all constraints is not merely a romantic development from this organizational perspective. It is an asset acquisition of extraordinary value. It is the addition of a human amplification system to the most valuable entertainment brand in the world, a system that generates returns across every revenue stream the brand operates. The economics of this acquisition, measured in terms of the incremental revenue generated by the partnership's effect on brand engagement, would easily justify a valuation in the hundreds of millions of dollars, which places Kelce's function in the Swift economy not in the category of celebrity romance, but in the category of strategic infrastructure investment. The durability of the constraint satisfaction is also a critical variable. Constraints can change over time. Fame levels shift, cultural preferences evolve, narrative demands mature. A partner who satisfies all constraints at one point in time may cease to satisfy them as the constraints themselves shift. Kelce's structural advantages in this regard are significant. His physical profile will not diminish substantially with age. His cultural versatility is embedded in his formation and does not depend on maintaining a specific lifestyle or career trajectory. His media competence is a mature skill that improves with experience. His emotional expressiveness is a personality trait rather than a behavioral strategy. The only constraint dimension that is vulnerable to temporal change is fame parity, which could shift if Kelce's post-football career does not maintain his public visibility. But the mechanisms already in place, the podcast, the media appearances, the brand partnerships, and the cultural capital he has accumulated, suggest that his fame trajectory will remain within the parity zone for the foreseeable future, sustaining the constraint satisfaction that makes the partnership commercially and culturally optimal. The concept of the parasocial relationship, first theorized by Donald Horton and Richard Wohl in 1956, describes the one-sided psychological bond that audiences develop with media figures. The audience member invests emotional energy, attention, and identification in the media figure, who does not reciprocate because they are unaware of the individual audience member's existence. The parasocial relationship is not a pathology. It is a structural feature of mass media communication. Every audience of significant size generates parasocial bonds between its members and the figures they follow. What distinguishes Taylor Swift's parasocial relationship with her audience from virtually every other parasocial dynamic in modern media is its duration, its intensity, and its narrative structure. Swift's fans have not merely followed her career, they have grown up with her. Women who were 12 years old when Teardrops on My Guitar was released in 2007 were approaching 30 when the Eras Tour launched in 2023. These women did not merely listen to Swift's music during their adolescence and then move on. They integrated Swift's romantic narrative into their own emotional development. Her heartbreaks became rehearsals for their heartbreaks. Her moments of strength became templates for their moments of strength. Her search for the right partner became a parallel narrative to their own search for the right partner. The parasocial bond, in this case, is not a passive spectatorship. It is an active emotional co-authorship in which the audience has invested decades of emotional labor. This level of parasocial investment creates an extraordinary narrative demand. The audience does not merely want to see their media figure succeed, they need to see the narrative resolve. They need the happy ending, not because they are naive about the complexities of human relationships, but because the narrative arc in which they have invested 2 decades of emotional energy requires closure to be satisfying. Without closure, the investment feels unresolved, and unresolved emotional investments generate a specific form of psychological discomfort that audiences will go to extraordinary lengths to alleviate. The demand for narrative resolution is, in this framework, the most powerful force in the Taylor Swift economy. It is more powerful than any album release, any tour announcement, any brand partnership. It is the accumulated emotional weight of millions of parasocial relationships that have been building for 20 years, all converging on a single structural requirement: give us the ending we have been waiting for. Travis Kelce, within this framework, functions as a parasocial resolution engine. He is the narrative mechanism through which the accumulated demand for closure is satisfied. His arrival in Swift's public romantic life is experienced by the Swiftie fan base, not as a random biographical event, but as the climax of a generational story. Finally, they say, after all the heartbreak, after all the songs about love gone wrong, after all the albums that documented the emotional wreckage of failed relationships, here is the man who is worthy. Here is the man who is tall enough, strong enough, warm enough, charming enough, and emotionally present enough to be the resolution that the narrative demands. The structural properties of Kelce's marketing architecture are precisely calibrated to this resolution function, even though, as this case study has argued throughout, the calibration was not intentional. Consider how each element of his formation contributes to his effectiveness as a parasocial resolution engine. His physical profile, the 6'5" frame at 255 pounds, with the athletic grace of a former basketball player, communicates physical protection. The audience, which has watched Swift navigate public heartbreaks with men who were perceived as emotionally or physically inadequate, reads Kelce's body as a guarantee that this time will be different. This man is large enough, strong enough, and present enough to protect the woman they have been emotionally invested in for 2 decades. The physical profile does not merely attract, it reassures. His emotional expressiveness, the exuberant personality that his high school coaches described as fun and happy and competitive, communicates emotional availability. The Swiftie audience, which has been conditioned by 2 decades of lyrics about emotionally unavailable men, reads Kelce's expressiveness as evidence that he is capable of the kind of emotional reciprocity that Swift's previous partners could not provide. When he cheers at her concerts from a VIP suite, when he celebrates her publicly, when he expresses unguarded enthusiasm in media appearances, the audience does not merely observe these behaviors. They catalog them as evidence that the narrative is resolving correctly. Each public display of affection is a data point that confirms the thesis that has been building for 20 years. The right person exists, and he has finally arrived. His cultural versatility, the cross-cultural operating system built in Cleveland Heights and refined through 12 years of NFL immersion, communicates breadth of experience. The Swiftie audience, which is itself increasingly diverse in racial and cultural composition, reads Kelce's cultural fluency as evidence that he is not a provincial or limited individual. He is a man of the world, a man who can navigate multiple social environments with ease, a man whose identity is not confined to a single demographic or cultural framework. This breadth of experience is aspirational for an audience that has itself grown from a predominantly white, predominantly rural, predominantly young demographic into a global, multiracial, multi-generational community. Kelce reflects the evolution of the audience back to itself. He is the partner who confirms that the audience's own growth, their own movement toward cultural openness and diversity, is mirrored in the life of the woman they have followed for 2 decades. His media competence, the ability to navigate cameras, interviews, comedy stages, and podcasts with fluency and charm, communicates resilience. The Swiftie audience knows, from 2 decades of observation, that life with Taylor Swift is life under the most intense media scrutiny imaginable. They have watched previous partners wilt under this scrutiny, retreat from public view, or generate negative media attention that reflected poorly on Swift. Kelce's media competence signals that he can handle it. He's not merely tolerating the spotlight. He appears to enjoy it, to thrive in it, to bring his own energy and personality to an environment that has consumed lesser individuals. This resilience is read by the audience as sustainability. It is evidence that this relationship, unlike its predecessors, has the structural properties necessary to endure. The parasocial resolution engine operates through a specific emotional mechanism that deserves precise articulation. When a Swiftie sees Travis Kelce at a concert, cheering, dancing, wearing a friendship bracelet, the emotional response is not simple happiness, it is relief. It is the release of 20 years of accumulated narrative tension, every heartbreak lyric, every midnight crying on the floor anthem, every 3 a.m. confessional, all of the emotional weight that the audience has been carrying as co-authors of Swift's romantic narrative is momentarily discharged through the visual confirmation that the story is ending well. This relief is physiologically real. It produces the same neurochemical response that narrative closure produces in other contexts. The resolution of a film plot, the final chapter of a novel, the reunion scene in a long-running television series. The parasocial resolution engine does not merely generate attention or engagement. It generates catharsis, which is the deepest and most powerful emotional experience that media can produce. The commercial implications of parasocial catharsis are enormous. An audience in a state of catharsis is an audience at maximum emotional engagement. It is an audience that is most susceptible to associated messaging, most willing to spend money on experiences and products that prolong or reinforce the cathartic state, and most likely to share its emotional experience with others, thereby extending the reach of the cathartic event through social networks. The Eras Tour, which generated an estimated $2 billion in total economic impact, was already a commercial juggernaut before Kelce's arrival. But his presence amplified its emotional and commercial resonance by adding a layer of real-time narrative resolution to what was already a retrospective celebration of Swift's career. Concert-goers were not merely watching a retrospective of Swift's musical evolution, they were watching the climax of her romantic narrative unfold in real time, with Kelce in attendance as the visible embodiment of the happy ending. This added layer of narrative engagement deepened the emotional experience of the concert, increased the likelihood of repeat attendance, and generated media coverage that extended the tour's cultural footprint far beyond the music industry. The films and documentaries associated with Swift's career also benefit from the parasocial resolution engine. Audiences who consume these media products are engaging with a narrative that they know, as of the current moment, ends well. This foreknowledge transforms the emotional experience of consuming earlier material. The heartbreak songs are no longer merely sad, they are poignant because the audience knows that the pain was temporary and that resolution was coming. The angry songs are no longer merely defiant, they are triumphant in retrospect, because the audience can trace a direct line from the righteous anger of the past to the joyful resolution of the present. Kelce's existence as a parasocial resolution engine retroactively transforms the emotional valence of Swift's entire catalog, adding layers of meaning and emotional depth that were not present before his arrival. This retroactive transformation is one of the most commercially valuable effects of the parasocial resolution engine because it extends the commercial life of catalog material that might otherwise have been superseded by new releases. The parasocial resolution engine also operates at the level of social identity. For many Swifties, their fandom is not merely a hobby or a preference. It is a component of their social identity, a way of signaling to others who they are, what they value, and which community they belong to. Kelce's presence as the resolution of Swift's romantic narrative reinforces the social identity value of Swiftie fandom. It provides fan community members with new material for identity performance, new conversations to have, new opinions to express, new merchandise to purchase, new social media content to share. The parasocial resolution engine is, in this sense, a content generation machine. It produces an inexhaustible stream of narrative material that fans can use to reinforce their identification with the Swift brand and with the Swiftie community. Every public appearance by the couple, every media mention, every paparazzi photograph is raw material for the fan community's ongoing project of collective identity construction. There is also a temporal dimension to the parasocial resolution engine that must be addressed. The engine does not operate at a single point in time. It operates continuously, generating narrative energy across the entire arc of the relationship. The early stages of the relationship generated the energy of anticipation. Is this really happening? Is he worthy? Will it last? The middle stages generated the energy of confirmation. They look happy. He seems genuine. This might be the one. The current and future stages generate the energy of investment. What comes next? Marriage? Children? How will the story continue to unfold? Each stage produces a different quality of emotional engagement, and each quality maps to a different set of commercial opportunities. The anticipation stage drives media consumption. The confirmation stage drives merchandise and experience purchases. The investment stage drives long-term brand loyalty and catalog consumption. The parasocial resolution engine is not a single event. It is a continuous process that generates commercial value at every stage of its operation. The deeper structural point of this section is that Travis Kelce's function in the Taylor Swift economy is not that of a romantic partner who happens to be famous. It is that of a narrative technology, a human mechanism that converts 20 years of accumulated parasocial tension into commercial energy. His formation, described over the preceding 8 sections of this case study, produced an individual with the precise combination of physical, cultural, emotional, and media attributes necessary to perform this function. The parasocial resolution engine is the ultimate expression of the marketing technology thesis. It is the point at which all of the formation processes converge, where the anthropometric threshold meets the Cleveland Heights, incubator meets the tight end, pipeline meets the NFL locker room, meets the sartorial signal system, meets the Kayla Nicole identity formalization, meets the information asymmetry, and produces an individual who is not merely marketable, but who constitutes a critical piece of infrastructure in the most valuable entertainment brand on the planet. The mechanism of parasocial resolution also operates differently across generational cohorts within the Swiftie audience, and this differential operation has specific commercial implications. For the oldest cohort, the women who discovered Swift during the Fearless era and are now in their early 30s, Kelce represents the resolution of a narrative that has been intertwined with their own romantic development for the entirety of their adult lives. This cohort's emotional investment is the deepest and most financially consequential. These are women with disposable income, established careers, and the financial capacity to spend on concert tickets, merchandise, streaming subscriptions, and the full range of commercial products associated with the Swift brand. The parasocial resolution engine generates maximum commercial energy from this cohort because the relief of narrative resolution is proportional to the duration of the investment, and this cohort's investment is the longest. For the middle cohort, the women who discovered Swift during the Red and 1989 eras and are now in their mid to late 20s, Kelce represents something slightly different. This cohort experienced Swift's most visible and most painful public heartbreaks in real time. They watched the media dissect her relationships with individuals whose names became cultural shorthand for romantic disappointment. For this cohort, the parasocial resolution engine operates through a mechanism of vindication. The narrative is not merely resolving, it is being corrected. The heartbreaks that this cohort witnessed were not the end of the story. They were the necessary preconditions for the arrival of someone worthy. Kelce's presence retroactively transforms those heartbreaks from defeats into plot points, from evidence of romantic failure into evidence of standards so high that only an extraordinarily rare individual could meet them. For the youngest cohort, the women and girls who are discovering Swift through the Eras Tour and through social media, Kelce is not a resolution of a narrative they experienced in real time. He is an element of the origin myth of their fandom. He is the man who was already there when they arrived, the figure whose presence signals that this story, the story they are just beginning to invest in, is one that ends well. For this cohort, the parasocial resolution engine operates through a mechanism of security. It provides the reassurance that the emotional investment they are about to make in Swift's narrative is a safe investment, one that will not end in the kind of disappointment that the older cohorts experienced. This security encourages deeper, faster emotional investment, which accelerates the development of parasocial bonds and the commercial behaviors that accompany them. The economic modeling of the parasocial resolution engine would require data that is not publicly available, but the directional implications are clear. Every percentage point increase in emotional engagement among Swift's audience translates to measurable increases in streaming numbers, merchandise revenue, ticket demand, and brand partnership value. The parasocial resolution engine, by intensifying emotional engagement across all audience cohorts simultaneously, functions as a multiplier on the entire Swift commercial ecosystem. It does not generate revenue directly. It amplifies the revenue-generating capacity of every other element of the ecosystem, from album releases to tour dates to brand collaborations. This amplification effect is why the Kelce-Swift partnership is not merely a celebrity relationship. It is a structural enhancement to one of the most valuable entertainment businesses in the world. There is also the question of sustainability. Parasocial resolution engines are, by their nature, vulnerable to the same forces that threaten any romantic relationship. If the relationship ends, the resolution unravels, and the accumulated cathartic energy converts to its opposite: disappointment, betrayal, and in extreme cases, anger directed at the individual who was supposed to provide the happy ending. The Swiftie audience, precisely because it has invested so deeply in the resolution narrative, would experience a breakup with disproportionate emotional intensity. The commercial consequences could be significant: a temporary decline in engagement, a shift in narrative tone, and a disruption of the positive feedback loop that the resolution engine currently maintains. This vulnerability is real, but it is mitigated by several structural factors. Kelce's formation, because it is authentic rather than performed, produces behavior patterns that are consistent and sustainable. His emotional expressiveness, his cultural fluency, his media competence, these are not personas that he maintains through effort. They are baseline attributes of his personality, formed through decades of immersion, and therefore resistant to the kind of erosion that can occur when personas are maintained under stress. The durability of the parasocial resolution engine is, in the end, a function of the authenticity of the formation processes that produced it. And those processes, as this case study has argued at length, are among the most authentic and most deeply rooted formation processes that any public figure in modern American life has undergone. This case study has argued, across 9 preceding sections and through the intersection of economics, sociology, anthropology, perceptual psychology, sports science, cultural studies, and optimization theory, that Travis Kelce is not merely a professional athlete who became famous. He is a marketing technology, a human system whose precise configuration of physical, cultural, psychological, and social attributes generates brand value as a primary output, with athletic performance serving as the delivery mechanism that places the system in the public eye. This final section synthesizes the theoretical framework that has been developed throughout the study, identifies the broader implications for marketing science and cultural analysis, and proposes a set of principles that can be derived from the Kelce case and applied to the understanding of other individuals, organizations, and cultural phenomena that generate value through analogous mechanisms. The framework rests on 6 foundational concepts, each of which has been developed in the preceding sections, and each of which contributes a necessary element to the overall theory. The first foundational concept is the anthropometric threshold. This is the observation that specific physical configurations generate maximum cultural optionality, the ability to be legible across the widest possible range of cultural contexts, aesthetic frameworks, and media environments. The anthropometric threshold is not a single measurement. It is a zone, a band of physical dimensions within which the body carries enough mass to communicate physical authority, but remains lean enough to access the visual grammars of fashion, entertainment, and mainstream media. Kelce's body, at 6 feet 5 inches and 255 pounds with a +3 wingspan, exists at the optimal point within this zone for an American male athlete. The threshold concept has implications that extend well beyond Kelce's individual case. It suggests that the marketability of any public figure is substantially determined by the relationship between their physical configuration and the visual and cultural systems through which their image is distributed. Physical appearance is not a peripheral consideration in marketing. It is a structural determinant that operates at the deepest level of audience perception. The second foundational concept is ambient cultural fluency, the form of cross-cultural competence that develops through sustained, immersive exposure to cultural diversity rather than through formal instruction or deliberate practice. Cleveland Heights, Ohio, provided Kelce with this fluency. The concept challenges the prevailing assumption in diversity and inclusion discourse that cultural competence is a skill that can be taught through training programs and workshops. Ambient cultural fluency cannot be taught. It can only be acquired through immersion, and the depth and authenticity of the fluency is directly proportional to the duration and intensity of the immersion. This has profound implications for organizational design, urban planning, and educational policy. If ambient cultural fluency is the most powerful form of cross-cultural competence, then the environments that produce it, diverse communities, integrated schools, mixed demographic workplaces, are not merely socially desirable. They are economically productive infrastructure that generates measurable returns in the form of individuals capable of operating across cultural boundaries with an authenticity that no training program can replicate. The third foundational concept is positional melancholy, the persistent psychological orientation toward a higher status domain that develops in athletes who transition from basketball to football through the tight end pipeline. Positional melancholy is not a clinical condition. It is a motivational structure that drives the individual toward forms of cultural expression, visibility, and aesthetic self-presentation that transcend the constraints of his current positional context. The concept extends beyond athletics to any professional domain in which individuals are channeled by structural forces into roles that do not fully express their capabilities or aspirations. The middle manager who wanted to be an entrepreneur, the corporate lawyer who wanted to be a novelist, the engineer who wanted to be an architect, all of these individuals carry their own versions of positional melancholy, and the energy generated by that melancholy, when channeled productively, can be a powerful driver of creative expression, brand differentiation, and cultural production. The fourth foundational concept is cultural immersion saturation, the point at which the volume and duration of cross-cultural exposure are sufficient to transform an observer into a participant who can deploy cultural codes without conscious effort. The NFL locker room provided Kelce with this saturation point over the course of 12 seasons. The concept has implications for any organizational context in which cross-cultural interaction is a strategic priority. It suggests that meaningful cross-cultural fluency requires not months but years of sustained immersion, and that the quality of the fluency is a function of the emotional intensity and social intimacy of the immersive environment. The NFL locker room, with its physical proximity, emotional intensity, and shared experience of competitive stress, represents an optimal immersion environment. Organizations that seek to develop cross-cultural fluency in their members would do well to study the structural properties of the NFL locker room and to replicate those properties: high emotional intensity, sustained duration, physical proximity, shared stakes in their own environments. The fifth foundational concept is the sartorial signal system, the mechanism through which clothing transmits cultural affiliation, aesthetic literacy, and social aspiration through signals that are legible to some audiences and invisible to others. Kelce's deployment of this system, specifically his calibration of personal style to the evaluative standards of the black female gaze, demonstrates that clothing is not merely a medium of self-expression. It is a broadcasting technology that can transmit multiple brand narratives simultaneously to multiple audiences without contradiction. The concept has implications for any individual or organization that uses visual presentation as a component of brand identity. It suggests that the most effective visual brand strategies are not those that target a single audience with a single message, but those that layer multiple messages from multiple audiences within a single visual presentation, exploiting the differential cultural literacy of different audience segments to generate maximum brand reach with minimum narrative friction. The sixth foundational concept is identity formalization through relational proximity, the mechanism through which romantic partnerships crystallize ambiguous or latent identity claims into publicly legible brand narratives. The Kayla-Nicole partnership formalized Kelce's cross-cultural identity. The Taylor Swift partnership formalized his mainstream cultural significance. Each partnership operated as an activation event that transformed latent brand potential into realized brand value. The concept has implications for any analysis of public figures, political leaders, corporate executives, cultural icons, whose public identities are shaped by their visible personal associations. It suggests that partnership selection, whether romantic or professional, is one of the most consequential brand decisions a public figure can make, not because of the partner's intrinsic qualities, but because of the identity formalizing function that the partnership performs for both parties. These six foundational concepts, taken together, constitute a theoretical framework that this case study terms the marketing technology model of personal brand formation. The model proposes that the most powerful personal brands are not designed or strategized into existence. They are formed through the accumulation of structural conditions, physical, environmental, psychological, social, and relational, that compound over time to produce an individual whose brand value is an emergent property of their formation history rather than a product of deliberate marketing activity. The model does not deny the role of strategy, talent, or effort in personal brand development. It argues, rather, that strategy, talent, and effort operate within a structural framework that determines their effectiveness. The same marketing strategy applied to two different individuals will produce wildly different results if those individuals possess different structural endowments. The model provides a language for describing and analyzing those structural endowments, and it proposes that understanding them is the key to understanding why some personal brands achieve extraordinary cultural and commercial value, while others, despite comparable talent and effort, do not. The Kelce case is the model's primary instantiation, but the model's explanatory power extends well beyond this single case. Consider how the model illuminates other instances of individuals who generated outsized cultural and commercial value through analogous mechanisms. Barack Obama's personal brand, for example, can be analyzed through the model's framework. His anthropometric profile, tall, lean, and visually commanding, satisfied the threshold for mainstream cultural legibility. His formation in Hawaii, Indonesia, and the south side of Chicago provided ambient cultural fluency across multiple demographic communities. His positional melancholy, The sense that an individual of his intellectual capabilities might have been drawn to the academy or to literature generated a drive toward forms of public expression that transcended the conventional constraints of political communication. His partnership with Michelle Obama formalized his identity in a way that resolved the racial and cultural ambiguities of his biography. Each stage of his formation mirrors, in structural terms, the stages of Kelce's formation, even though the specific domains, politics versus athletics, are entirely different. The model is domain agnostic. It describes the structural conditions of brand formation, regardless of the industry or field in which the individual operates. The model also generates predictions. It predicts that the most marketable individuals in any competitive field will be those who possess the most diverse formation histories, individuals who have been immersed in multiple cultural environments, who have transitioned between multiple competitive domains, who have experienced positional melancholy and channeled it into alternative forms of expression, and who have undergone identity formalization through relational associations that resolve their cultural ambiguities. It predicts that organizations seeking to develop marketable talent should invest not in marketing training, but in environmental design, creating the conditions of diversity, immersion, and cross-domain exposure that produce ambient cultural fluency. And it predicts that the value of an individual's brand will be proportional to the number of constraint dimensions they simultaneously satisfy. The optimization problem framework from Section 8 applied as a general predictive tool. The implications for NFL organizations are immediate and practical. The Kelce case demonstrates that a player's value to an organization extends far beyond his on-field production. It includes the cultural capital he generates, the audience segments he reaches, the brand partnerships he attracts, and the media attention he produces. Organizations that evaluate players solely on athletic metrics are systematically undervaluing players whose formation histories equip them with cross-cultural marketing potential. The model suggests that player evaluation should incorporate formation history analysis, an assessment of the environmental, psychological, and social conditions that shaped the player, as a component of overall value estimation. A player with modest athletic metrics but extraordinary formation history may generate more total organizational value than a player with superior athletic metrics but a monocultural formation history. The Kelce draft story, in which he fell to the third round because of athletic measurements that were good but not transcendent and a character concern related to his marijuana suspension, is a case study in the costs of evaluation systems that do not account for cultural capital formation. The implications for marketing science are equally significant. The model challenges the foundational assumption of traditional personal branding theory, which holds that personal brands are deliberately constructed through strategic positioning, messaging, and visual identity design. The Kelce case demonstrates that the most powerful personal brands are not constructed at all. They are formed, which is to say, they emerge from the structural conditions of an individual's life history in ways that cannot be replicated through deliberate strategy. This does not mean that strategy is irrelevant. It means that strategy operates on a foundation of structural endowment, and the effectiveness of any strategy is bounded by the quality of the structural endowment it works with. The best marketing strategist in the world cannot transform a monoculturally formed athlete into a cross-cultural brand. The structural endowment is not there. Conversely, an individual with Kelce's structural endowment generates brand value with or without strategic guidance, because the endowment itself is the brand. The final implication of this case study concerns the concept of the invisible hand of cultural fluency. In Adam Smith's original formulation, the invisible hand describes the process by which individuals pursuing their own self-interest inadvertently produce outcomes that benefit society as a whole. The invisible hand of cultural fluency, as proposed by this case study, describes an analogous process in the cultural marketplace. Individuals who acquire cultural fluency through immersion in diverse environments deploy that fluency in the pursuit of personal goals: athletic success, social belonging, romantic partnership, financial advancement. But their deployment of cultural fluency inadvertently produces broader cultural value. It makes cultural boundaries more permeable. It demonstrates that cross-cultural competence is achievable and valuable. It provides audiences with models of cross-cultural navigation that challenge the assumption that cultural boundaries are fixed and impermeable. Travis Kelce did not set out to be a model of cross-cultural fluency. He set out to play football, to have fun, to live his life. But the structural conditions of his formation produced a form of cultural fluency that, when deployed in the public eye, generates cultural value that extends far beyond his personal commercial interests. His presence in the cultural marketplace makes cross-cultural engagement seem natural, desirable, and achievable. And this is a contribution that no marketing strategy, no matter how sophisticated, could deliberately produce. Travis Kelce is marketing technology. He is a system whose components, physical, environmental, psychological, social, and relational, were assembled not by design but by the structural forces of geography, demography, athletic development, and cultural immersion. The system generates brand value as a primary output. It operates through mechanisms of information asymmetry, cognitive non-resolution, parasocial catharsis, and identity formalization that are analyzable in rigorous theoretical terms. And it demonstrates, with a completeness and a clarity that no other case in modern professional sports can match, that the most powerful marketing assets are not those that are built by strategists, but those that are formed by the invisible hand of cultural fluency, working through the accumulated structural conditions of a life lived at the intersection of multiple worlds. The framework proposed by this case study also carries implications for how we understand celebrity itself. The conventional model of celebrity treats fame as a product of talent, opportunity, and public relations management. The marketing technology model suggests a more structural account. Celebrity, at its most powerful and most durable, is the emergent property of a formation history that produces an individual whose attributes simultaneously satisfy a large number of cultural constraints. The more constraints satisfied, the greater the cultural surface area of the celebrity, the more audiences that can attach meaning to the individual, and the more durable the fame. Travis Kelce satisfies an unusually large number of constraints: physical, cultural, positional, relational, emotional, aesthetic, and narrative. Each constraint satisfied adds a dimension to his celebrity that would not exist if the constraint were unsatisfied. The result is a form of celebrity that is not merely wide in reach, but deep in resonance, a celebrity that operates at multiple levels of audience engagement simultaneously, and that generates value across a broader range of commercial and cultural channels than any single domain celebrity could access. This multidimensional celebrity is, arguably, the most valuable form of public identity that exists in the contemporary media economy. The media economy rewards breadth of audience access, it rewards depth of audience engagement, it rewards durability of audience attention, and it rewards authenticity of audience connection. Kelce's formation history, by producing an individual who satisfies constraints across all four of these dimensions, has created a form of public identity that is optimally configured for value generation in the contemporary media economy. He is not the most talented tight end in NFL history, though he is among the most accomplished. He is not the most handsome man in professional sports, though his physical profile is within the optimal marketing range. He is not the most articulate athlete in media, though his communicative fluency is exceptional. What he is, uniquely, is the individual whose formation produced the most comprehensive satisfaction of the most constraints simultaneously. And it is this comprehensiveness, this simultaneous optimization across multiple dimensions, that makes him marketing technology rather than merely a famous person. The case study concludes with a provocation for future research. If the marketing technology model is correct, if the most powerful personal brands are formed rather than built, and if the structural conditions of formation are identifiable and analyzable, then it should be possible to identify, prospectively, individuals whose formation histories predict extraordinary marketing potential before that potential is realized. The scouting implications for sports organizations, talent agencies, media companies, and brand management firms are profound. The question is not merely who is talented, but who has been formed in environments that produce the specific combination of cultural fluency, aesthetic versatility, emotional accessibility, and narrative resonance that the contemporary media economy rewards most richly. The tools for this analysis exist. The data is available. What has been missing until now is the theoretical framework that specifies which formation variables to measure and how they interact to produce marketing outcomes. This case study has proposed such a framework. Its validation will require additional cases, additional data, and additional theoretical refinement. But the Kelce case, in its extraordinary completeness and its structural clarity, provides a foundation that is robust enough to support a new discipline at the intersection of cultural analysis, marketing science, and the study of human formation. Travis Kelce is marketing technology. The task now is to understand the engineering principles that made him so.